The gelding screamed before Jackson Kane's boots hit the porch. 3 years of living alone had taught him to trust that horse more than memory, more than hope, more than the illusion that tomorrow might differ from the empty procession of yesterdays. He grabbed the Winchester from above the door, framed muscle memory from a life that felt like it belonged to someone else, and pushed into the February night. Snow fell in sheets, erasing the world beyond 10 feet. Montana in winter was a white void, beautiful and merciless, the kind of landscape that killed without malice or hesitation. Jackson's lantern carved a weak sphere of yellow light as he crossed the yard, his breath visible in ragged clouds. The barn door hung open, swinging in the wind, Russ screaming against iron hinges he'd been meaning to oil since Sarah died. Sarah. The name still caught in his throat like a fishhook. 3 years, 2 months, 16 days since fever had stolen her in that bed inside the cabin, since he'd lowered her into frozen ground beneath the pine tree where they'd carved their initials 20 years prior. The preacher had said grief grew lighter with time, that wounds scabbed over and eventually faded to scars you could carry without bleeding. The preacher had been wrong. Jackson shoved the barn door wider, lantern raised, rifle ready. His mare stood in her stall, ears pinned back, nostrils flared, staring at something in the shadows near the hay bales where he stored winter feed. Not a mountain lion she'd be rearing and kicking. Not a bear, wrong time of year. Something else, something that didn't belong. The lantern light found them huddled against the far wall like refugees from a disaster he couldn't name. 5 children pressed together for warmth, their eyes reflecting gold in the lamplight, feral and frightened. And slumped against the hay, barely breathing, a woman with blood dried on the side of her face and one boot missing. Jackson's throat tightened. The oldest child rose slowly, a girl of maybe 12 with dark hair escaping a braid, thin shoulders squared despite trembling limbs. She positioned herself between Jackson and the others, and something in her stance, protective, desperate, ready to die if necessary, reminded him of a wolf he'd once found defending her cubs from a grizzly. The wolf had died. The cubs had died. Nature was efficient that way. The girl's voice came out steady despite the shaking. We didn't take nothing, just needed somewhere warm. Jackson lowered the rifle an inch, his gaze moving from her to the woman to the 4 smaller children behind the girl. A boy around 8, pushing 2 little ones back, his hands protective on their shoulders. A scrawny teenager with fists, clenched chin jutting forward in defiance that looked more like terror. And in the very back, a tiny boy with wheat-colored curls clutching something to his chest, too young to understand danger, only that something was very wrong. How long you been here? Jackson's voice sounded foreign to his own ears, rough from disuse. He'd spoken to Doc Foster 2 weeks ago when he'd bought supplies in town, 5 words total. Before that, nothing since Christmas when Pastor Gray had tried to convince him to attend services. He'd declined. The girl's jaw tightened. Since before dark. Jackson knelt beside the woman, setting the lantern down, keeping the rifle within reach. Up close, he could see her dress was torn at the hem, soaked through with melted snow. Her skin burned with fever beneath his palm when he touched her forehead, heat radiating through layers of grime and exhaustion. Blood matted her hair on one side, the wound shallow but ugly. Bruises ringed her wrists in the shape of fingers, purple and yellow, at least a week old. She needs to be inside. Jackson stood slowly, keeping his movements deliberate. She'll die out here before morning. We ain't going nowhere with you. The girl's composure cracked for half a second, fear flashing across her young face before the mask slammed back into place. We don't know you. The 80-year-old boy whispered something, tugging at the girl's sleeve. She shook him off hard, eyes never leaving Jackson. Ben shut it. Jackson had seen that look before in men who'd been beaten down by life, until trust became a luxury they couldn't afford, a risk they wouldn't take. Sarah used to volunteer at the orphan asylum in Billings before they'd moved to the ranch, and she'd come home with stories about children who'd been hurt so badly they'd forgotten how to accept kindness. He'd never understood it then. Now, standing in his barn with terrified children and a dying woman, he understood perfectly. Name's Jackson Kane. This is my land, my barn, my house, about 50 yards that way. There's a fire going and coffee on the stove. I got blankets and bread and a pot of stew that's been simmering since noon. He paused, choosing his next words carefully. I also buried my wife 3 winters back and haven't had a soul to share a meal with since. So you can stay here and freeze, or you can let me help. Either way, I ain't calling no sheriff, and I ain't asking for nothing in return. The barn fell silent except for wind rattling loose boards overhead. The woman's breathing was shallow, ragged, each exhale a whisper of mortality. The smallest child let out a thin whimper, not quite a cry, just an exhausted sound that seemed to drain what little strength the cold hadn't already stolen. The girl's shoulders dropped half an inch. Fine, but I'm watching you. I'd expect nothing less. Jackson gathered the woman into his arms. She weighed almost nothing, just bones and fever wrapped in wet cotton, and headed toward the cabin. The children followed in a ragged line, the girl bringing up the rear, her eyes boring into his back with the intensity of someone who'd learned surveillance was survival. The cabin wasn't much, 2 rooms separated by a doorway with no door, a stone fireplace Sarah had insisted on when they'd built the place a kitchen that hadn't been properly cleaned since her funeral. But it was warm, and right now warm was the difference between living and dying. Jackson laid the woman on his bed, the same bed where Sarah had taken her last breath, where he'd held her hand and watched the light leave her eyes and felt something inside himself shatter so completely he wasn't sure all the pieces still existed. Something tightened in his chest, old grief mixing with new purpose, but he pushed it down. There'd be time for that later. Always time for grief. It waited patient as winter. He turned to the girl who stood in the doorway like a soldier at her post. You. Get those wet clothes off the little ones. There's blankets in the chest by the fire. She hesitated, calculation flickering across her young face. What if now, girl? They're shaking like leaves. She moved. The other children watched Jackson with eyes too old for their faces as he examined the woman's wounds. The gash along her hairline wasn't deep but needed cleaning. The bruises on her wrists told a story he didn't want to twin. Her feet bare except for one sock were rubbed raw blisters on top of blisters, the kind of damage that came from walking miles without proper shoes. What's her name? The boy who'd whispered earlier spoke up, his voice cautious. Emma. Emma Reed. She's our ma. Jackson glanced at him at the slight hesitation before ma, the way the other children's eyes cut to the fierce girl for permission. All of you, the boy's gaze shifted. She takes care of us. That's what matters. Jackson understood. Blood didn't make a family any more than a ring made a marriage. It was the staying that counted, the choosing to show up day after day when walking away would be easier. Sarah used to say that. He went to the kitchen and ladled stew into bowls, 5 of them, then a 6th for himself that he set aside. When he brought the food to the children, they stared at it like they'd forgotten what a full meal looked like the concept of abundance had been beaten out of them by miles and fear and empty bellies. Eat slow. Your stomachs ain't used to much. The smallest one, the boy with weak curls and eyes, the color of cornflowers, reached for the bowl with both hands. The 8-year-old helped him hold it steady, careful not to spill a drop. Thank you, mister. Jackson. The boy blinked. Thank you, Jackson. The fierce girl didn't eat. She sat apart from the others, back straight, watching the bedroom door, where Emma lay unconscious, and Jackson saw in her face what he'd been feeling for 3 years, the weight of being responsible for someone you couldn't save, the terror of watching them slip away despite everything you tried. She'll wake, Jackson kept his voice low. The girl's eyes snapped to him. You don't know that. No, but I've seen worse pull through. She studied him. This man who'd emerged from a blizzard with a rifle and a lantern, and a grief so palpable, it felt like a 6th person in the room. You're not lying. It wasn't a question, but he answered anyway. I don't have the energy for lies anymore. Something shifted in her expression, not trust exactly, but maybe acknowledgement that they shared something. Exhaustion, desperation, the bone-deep weariness of people who'd run out of options and found themselves in a stranger's barn, begging for mercy. The man who did this. Jackson chose his words carefully. He following you. The girl's face went blank, practiced neutrality that came from years of hiding. What makes you think a man did it? Bruises on her wrists are shaped like fingers. Gash on her head came from something swung, not something fallen against. Jackson held her gaze. And you didn't ask if I meant a man. You asked what made me think it. Silence stretched between them, broken only by the fire crackling and the smallest boy slurping his stew. Finally, the girl spoke, her voice flat and hard as winter ground. His name's Victor Cross. He's Emma's brother-in-law. Was sheriff back in Ridgeway, might still be. We've been running 3 weeks. Hard to know what's true anymore. Jackson absorbed this. A sheriff meant law, meant authority, meant men with badges who asked questions and didn't like answers that didn't fit their narrative. Sarah had always said the worst wolves wore sheep's clothing, that sometimes the people with the most power were the ones who abused it most. He got a claim on her. Says she owes his family money. Says she stole from them after Daniel died. The girl's voice hardened. Daniel was Emma's husband, Victor's brother, died in a mining accident 2 years back. Jackson waited. There was more, he could feel it hovering in the space between them. Except it wasn't no accident. The girl leaned forward, firelight casting shadows across her young face. Daniel found out Victor was skimming from the miner's wages, was going to report him. Week later, the tunnel collapsed. 32 men went in that morning. 14 came out. Cold settled in Jackson's gut that had nothing to do with winter. And Emma knows this. Emma's the one who figured it out. Found the real ledgers hidden in Victor's office, matched them against what the mine company reported. That's why Victor wants her back. The girl's eyes glittered. Dead wives don't testify. Outside, the wind howled like something wounded. Inside, 4 children ate stew with the single-minded focus of the starving, unaware that the 2 adults were discussing murder and corruption and the lengths desperate men would go to protect their secrets. The smallest boy's head began to nod his spoon, slipping from tiny fingers. The 8-year-old caught it before it fell, setting it gently in the empty bowl. She won't die here. Jackson's voice came out harder than intended. Whatever happens next, she doesn't die in my house. The girl looked at him with eyes that had seen too much known, too much carried too much. Why do you care? You don't know us. Jackson thought about Sarah, about the empty years since her death, about how he'd stopped speaking to neighbors and attending church, and caring about anything beyond the basic mechanics of survival. He thought about the grave under the pine tree and the promises he'd made, standing over it, promises about living, about honoring her memory by remaining part of the world instead of retreating into himself. No, but I know what it's like to lose everything and have nowhere to go. He stood moving toward the bedroom. And I know my wife would have taken you in without a second thought. Reckon that's reason enough. Before the girl could respond, a sound came from the bedroom. A cough, weak but unmistakable. Emma was waking. Jackson reached the doorway first but stopped at the threshold, some instinct warning him not to crowd a frightened woman. Emma struggled to sit up, her eyes wild with confusion and fear, her hands shooting out to search for something, a weapon, a handhold, anything familiar in this strange place. Easy. He kept his voice gentle. Easy now. Emma's gaze locked onto him, a stranger in the room where she'd lost consciousness, and he saw panic flood her features. The children. They're safe. They're right here. The fierce girl pushed past Jackson and rushed to Emma's side, her controlled facade cracking. Ma, it's okay. He helped us. Emma's breathing came ragged as she looked from the girl to Jackson to the other children visible through the doorway, their faces turned toward her with varying expressions of relief and worry. Where are we, my ranch? About 2 miles east of Copper Creek. Emma's face paled. That's only 4 days from Ridgeway, closer to 3 if the roads are clear. She tried to stand, her legs buckling immediately. The girl caught her and Jackson moved forward to help, but Emma flinched away from his touch. We have to go. We can't stay here. He'll find us. There's a blizzard outside that'll kill you faster than any man. Jackson's voice cut through her panic. Whatever's chasing you can wait till morning. You don't understand. I understand enough. The girl told me about Victor Cross. Emma's eyes snapped to the girl. Annie, he needed to know, Ma, in case Victor comes. If Victor comes here, then I'll deal with Victor. Jackson said it simply the same way he'd say he'd mend a fence or check the horses, just another task in a long line of tasks that made up a life. Emma stared at him, and he could see her trying to reconcile his calm with her terror, trying to understand why this stranger would put himself between her and a man with a badge and a gun and nothing to lose. You don't know what he's capable of, and he don't know what I'm capable of. Reckon that makes us even. Something flickered across Emma's face, surprise maybe, or the ghost of hope she'd stopped allowing herself to feel. Why would you help us? Jackson considered the question. It was fair. A stranger with 5 children and a dangerous man hunting her wasn't anyone's idea of welcome company. He thought about Sarah, about the last conversation they'd had before the fever took her speech. How she'd squeezed his hand and whispered that kindness was the only thing worth doing that didn't cost nothing. He'd told her she was wrong about the bhakti, and she'd smiled and said she was right about the worth. My wife used to say that kindness was the only thing worth doing that didn't cost nothing. He met Emma's gaze. She was wrong about the key, but she was right about the worth. Emma's eyes glistened, but she blinked hard, refusing to let the tears fall. We'll leave at first light. You'll leave when you're able to walk without falling. Not before, I can't ask you to. You didn't ask. The cabin fell quiet. Through the doorway, the children had stopped eating to listen, their faces reflecting hope and fear in equal measure. The smallest boy, Tommy, spoke up, his voice thin and uncertain. Please, Ma, I'm tired of running. Emma's composure shattered. She pressed a hand to her mouth, shoulders shaking with silent sobs. Annie wrapped thin arms around her, and Jackson stepped back, giving them privacy he hadn't known they needed. He returned to the main room where the other children sat frozen. Your ma's awake. She's going to be fine. Tommy tugged on Jackson's sleeve with one small hand. Is the bad man coming? Jackson crouched to the boy's level, meeting eyes that held too much knowledge for a child so young. What's your name, son? Tommy. Well, Tommy, you see that door over there? The boy nodded. Ain't nobody coming through that door tonight, except the folks I want coming through, you understand? Tommy studied Jackson's face with the grave seriousness only a 3-year-old could manage, the kind of intensity that suggested he was weighing Jackson's words against every broken promise and failed protection he'd known in his short life. You promise, I promise. Tommy considered this, then nodded once and returned to his stew. The other children relaxed incrementally, their shoulders dropping, their grips on spoons loosening. Jackson stood and moved to the window, looking out into the endless white. Snow fell in hypnotic patterns, covering everything, erasing tracks, hiding the past beneath layers of blank future. In the bedroom, Emma's sobs gradually quieted. Annie's voice murmured something too soft to hear. The fire crackled its slow rhythm, and Jackson felt the weight of 6 lives pressing against the walls of his small cabin, filling the empty spaces Sarah's death had carved out. For 3 years, he'd lived in silence, speaking only when necessity demanded, existing in the hollow shell of a life that had once held meaning. Now suddenly his home echoed with children's breathing and a woman's grief and the promise he'd made to a frightened boy. The walls felt smaller, the air felt warmer, and somewhere deep in his chest, something that had been frozen for a very long time began cautiously to thaw. The night wore on. Emma slept again, real sleep this time, her fever breaking sometime around midnight. The children made beds on the floor near the fire, wrapped in quilts that still smelled faintly of lavender and dust. Sarah's quilts washed and folded, but unused since her death. Annie helped the younger ones settle her movements, efficient and tender. A girl forced to become a mother before she'd finished being a child. Jackson sat by the window, rifle across his knees, watching the storm rage against the glass. He wasn't keeping watch for Victor Cross, not exactly. The blizzard was too thick for travel, and even a desperate man would wait for dawn. But sitting here felt right. Somehow felt like purpose, felt like the first meaningful action he'd taken since lowering Sarah into frozen ground. Annie appeared beside him sometime after midnight, moving quietly like someone who'd learned to never announce her presence. You don't have to keep watch. Storm's too thick for anyone to travel. Probably right. Then why? Jackson was silent for a moment, organizing thoughts he hadn't spoken aloud in years. 3 years ago, I watched my wife die in that bed. Fever took her in 3 days. I sat right here in this chair, and I couldn't do nothing but watch. Annie didn't speak, just stood there in the dark listening. After she passed, I stopped keeping watch. Jackson's voice roughened. Stopped caring if someone came through that door in the night. Stopped caring about much of anything, if I'm honest. He turned to look at her. Tonight I got 5 children and a woman who need protecting. For the first time in 3 years, I got something worth staying awake for. Annie absorbed this, her young face serious in the firelight. You're not what I expected. What did you expect? Someone who wanted something. Everyone always wants something. I want you to survive. Jackson held her gaze. That enough for now? She almost smiled. Almost. Yeah. That's enough. She returned to her blanket near the fire, curling beside Grace, the 7-year-old girl who clung to Annie with the desperation of someone who had already lost one mother and couldn't bear to lose another. Soon her breathing evened out into sleep. Her guard finally dropped in this warm room with a man who kept his promises. Jackson remained at the window. The lantern burned low, casting moving shadows across the walls. Outside, the storm raged on burying tracks, covering trails, hiding everything that had come before. Come morning, the world would be white and new blank as an empty page. But Jackson knew better than to trust a clean slate. Some stains didn't wash away with snow. Some followed you until you stopped running long enough to face them. Emma Reed had stopped running, or the blizzard had stopped her, which amounted to the same thing. Now the question was whether Copper Creek would let her stay, whether a small town with small minds could look past gossip and see a woman who'd walked through hell with 5 children and emerged on the other side battered but breathing. He thought about Sarah, about what she'd say if she could see him now harboring fugitives, defying whatever law Victor Cross claimed to represent, putting himself between a desperate woman and a dangerous man. Sarah would approve. She'd always had a soft spot for strays, and underdogs had always believed that the measure of a person was how they treated those who had nothing to offer in return. A coyote howled somewhere in the distance, its cry swallowed by wind and snow. Jackson shifted the rifle in his lap, his finger resting light on the trigger guard. Not aiming, not threatening, just ready. He'd been a soldier once before Sarah, before the ranch, before Montana. He'd learned to wait in the dark with a weapon and a purpose, learned to distinguish between the sounds of nature and the sounds of approaching danger. Tonight there was only the storm. Tomorrow, he suspected, would bring something else entirely. But tonight in this cabin, 6 souls found shelter from the cold. And for now, for this single breath of time, carved out from the endless procession of empty days, that was enough. Dawn came gray and bitter light, seeping through the windows, like something reluctant. Jackson woke in the chair by the window. His neck stiff, the rifle still warm in his lap from his body heat. He hadn't meant to sleep, but exhaustion had claimed him, sometime around 3, when the wind finally died and the snow stopped falling. The world outside lay buried under 2 feet of fresh powder, pristine and silent, the kind of silence that rang in your ears. Emma stood at the stove, one hand braced against the counter for balance, stirring something in a pot. She'd changed into dry clothes, one of Sarah's dresses, the green one with tiny white flowers, and her hair hung loose around her shoulders, damp from washing. The bruise on her temple stood out stark against pale skin, purple and yellow like a sunset gone wrong. You should be resting. Jackson set the rifle aside and stood, joints cracking. Emma didn't turn around. Been resting all night. Figured I owed you breakfast at least. You don't owe me nothing. She did turn then, and Jackson saw her eyes were clear despite exhaustion carving lines around her mouth. Maybe not, but I'm cooking anyway. Keeps my hands busy, Jackson understood. After Sarah died, he'd rebuilt the entire south fence in a week, working until his hands bled and his back screamed because movement was easier than stillness, and exhaustion was easier than thought. He moved to the sink and splashed cold water on his face, the shock of it clearing the fog from his brain. The children still slept in a tangle of limbs and blankets near the dying fire. Tommy had his thumb in his mouth, curled against Ben's chest. Grace sprawled across Annie's legs, one arm flung wide. Marcus, the teenage boy, slept separate from the others, his back to the wall, even in sleep, maintaining distance. How long they been with you? Jackson kept his voice low. Emma's stirring slowed. Different times. Ben and Grace are mine by blood. Their father, my husband Daniel, he died 2 years ago. Tommy came to us 6 months before that. His mother died in childbirth at a way station. She begged me with her last breath to keep him safe. And the others, Annie, we found at a rail depot in Kansas. Her parents died of cholera, no other family willing to take her in. She was 10 years old, stealing bread because she hadn't eaten in 4 days. Emma's voice roughened. Marcus showed up at our door one night, beaten half to death by his stepfather. Said if I sent him back, the man would finish the job. Jackson poured coffee from the pot. Emma had somehow gotten started, the bitter smell cutting through the cabin's stale air. You could have turned them away. Most would have. I tried with Annie, told her the orphan asylum would find her a proper home, that I barely had enough to feed my own children. Emma's hands stilled on the wooden spoon. She looked at me with these eyes, old eyes, too old for a child, and said she'd rather starve free than eat in a cage. Something in her voice reminded me of myself at that age, after my own mother died and my father remarried a woman who saw me as an inconvenience. So you kept her. So I kept her. And then Marcus came, and then Victor started circling like a vulture, and I realized I'd built exactly the kind of family that made me vulnerable. 5 children depending on me, giving Victor leverage. She met Jackson's gaze. If he hurts them to get to me, that's on my conscience forever. Jackson thought about Sarah, about the baby they'd lost. 8 years into their marriage, a daughter born too early, too small, living only 3 hours before her lungs gave out. Sarah had blamed herself, convinced her body had failed their child. He'd held her while she sobbed and sworn it wasn't her fault, knowing she didn't believe him, knowing grief didn't respond to logic or love. Evil men hurt people because they're evil. Jackson's voice came out harder than he intended. Not because their victims gave them reason. You didn't make Victor into what he is. Emma's eyes glistened, but she blinked hard and turned back to the stove. Tell that to the part of me that keeps thinking if I just signed his papers, given him what he wanted, maybe we'd all still be safe in Ridgeway. Would you, though, or would he have found another reason, another excuse? She didn't answer, but her shoulders tightened, and Jackson knew she'd asked herself that question 1,000 times already. He moved to the window, looking out at the buried landscape. Smoke rose from chimneys in the distance, proof that Copper Creek existed beyond his self-imposed exile. He hadn't been to town in 3 weeks, hadn't spoken to anyone except Doc Foster during that supply run, and that conversation had consisted of grunts and nods. Sarah used to drag him into town every Sunday for services, then coffee at Martha Jenkins' house, then gossip and small talk that made him want to crawl out of his skin. But Sarah had loved it, loved being part of something bigger than their isolated ranch, loved knowing her neighbors and being known in return. After she died, the town had tried to fold him into its embrace, casseroles and condolences, offers of help and company. He didn't want. He'd pulled away, retreated into silence, and eventually they'd stopped trying. Now he had a house full of people who needed more than he knew how to give, and the town he'd been avoiding for 3 years suddenly represented safety or danger. He couldn't decide which. Behind him, Annie stirred, sitting up slowly, her hand immediately checking that the younger children were still there, still breathing, still safe. Old habits, Jackson thought. The kind that came from losing people you loved, from learning that sleep was when bad things happened. Annie's eyes found Jackson, then Emma, cataloging the scene with the precision of someone who'd learned to assess threats before fully waking. Morning, morning. Jackson handed her a cup of coffee, black and strong enough to strip paint. You eat breakfast yet? Annie accepted the cup with both hands, savoring the warmth. Don't usually eat breakfast. Makes lunch hit harder. The casual way she said it, the logic of someone rationing scarce resources, made Jackson's chest tighten. Well, you're eating breakfast today. Emma's cooking enough to feed half of Montana. Annie almost smiled, but it died before reaching her eyes. What's the plan? Jackson glanced at Emma, who'd gone still at the stove. Plan is to keep you safe until we figure out what comes next. That's not a plan. That's a hope. Fair point. Jackson set his coffee down. Victor know you're here, not yet, but he'll figure it out. She paused. He's not stupid. Mean, but not stupid. He'll check every ranch within 20 miles of Ridgeway, question every person we might have talked to. How long until he reaches Copper Creek? Annie's face closed down, calculation flickering behind her eyes. If the roads are clear, 3 days, maybe 4 if he's being thorough, then we got 3 days to prepare. Prepare how? Annie's voice sharpened. You can't fight him. He's got a badge, got deputies, got the law on his side. People listen to sheriffs. People don't listen to... She hesitated, to women running with stolen children. Jackson felt his jaw tighten. You're not stolen, and badges don't make men righteous. Try telling that to a judge. Before Jackson could respond, Grace woke with a soft cry, sitting bolt upright, her eyes unfocused and frightened. Emma moved immediately, kneeling beside her, voice gentle. Shh, baby. You're safe. Just a dream. Grace blinked, recognition flooding her young face, and she threw herself into Emma's arms, sobbing. The bad men were chasing us again. They had guns and fire and... Just a dream, Grace. Emma rocked her slowly, one hand stroking the girl's hair. We're not running anymore. We're staying here with Mr. Kane until it's safe. Grace pulled back, tears streaming down her cheeks. But it's never safe. Every time you say we're safe, we have to run again. The raw truth of it hung in the air, and Jackson saw Emma's face crumple before she caught herself smoothing her expression back into something resembling confidence. This time is different, sweetheart. How Emma's eyes found Jackson's across the room, and he saw the question there, the desperate hope that he might have an answer she could believe in, because Mr. Kane is going to help us. And this time we're not alone. Grace turned to look at Jackson, her tear-stained face grave and assessing. You promised. Jackson crouched down to her level, remembering Tommy's question last night, remembering what it meant to make promises to children who'd been failed by every adult in their lives. I promise I'll do everything in my power to keep you safe. That's all anyone can promise, but I mean it with everything I got. Grace studied his face for a long moment, then nodded slowly and turned back to Emma. Okay, I believe him. Something in Jackson's chest cracked open at that this small girl's willingness to trust again, despite everything she'd endured. Sarah would have loved these children, would have gathered them close and found ways to make them laugh, to help them remember they were still allowed to be children despite the darkness they'd seen. Sarah. The memory hit him suddenly visceral and unwelcome. 3 years ago, February, like now, snow falling in sheets while he held her hand and watched her die. She'd woken that morning complaining of a headache. Nothing serious, just one of those nuisances that came with winter and close quarters. By noon, she had a fever. By evening, she couldn't keep down water. Doc Foster had ridden out through a storm worse than last night's, his face grim as he examined her, and Jackson had known from the doctor's expression what the verdict would be even before he heard the words. Pneumonia, maybe, or influenza. Hard to say. Sometimes the sickness came on fast like this, burning through a body before medicine could take hold. Foster had done what he could: cold compress his broth when she could stomach it, prayers when medicine failed. Sarah had fought for 3 days. Jackson had sat exactly where he'd sat last night, watching her fade by increments, helpless rage building in his chest, because he could break horses and mend fences and survive Montana winters, but he couldn't save the one person who mattered. On the third night, she'd woken lucid for the first time in days. Her hand had found his, weak but insistent. Jackson, I'm here. His throat had been too tight for more words. Don't let this make you hard. Her voice barely a whisper. Don't let losing me turn you into stone. He'd promised, knowing even then it was a promise he'd break. After she died, after he'd buried her under that pine tree and carved her name into wood, he'd pulled away from everyone and everything, building walls that kept grief in and life out. Until last night, when 5 children and a desperate woman had stumbled into his barn and reminded him that walls kept out pain, but also purpose, also meaning, also every reason a person had for drawing breath. Jackson. Emma's voice pulled him back to the present. She stood close now, Grace on her hip, concern etched across her features. You all right? Just remembering. Jackson straightened, shaking off the past. Your husband, Daniel. What was he like? Emma's expression softened and hardened simultaneously. Love and loss braiding together. He was good. Too good for Victor, that's certain. They were brothers, but you'd never know it to look at them. Daniel believed in fairness and honest work, in treating miners like men instead of machinery. And Victor believed in profit. Emma shifted Grace to her other hip. He'd been running the mine for 5 years when Daniel joined on as foreman. Daniel thought he could be a good influence, help Victor see the workers as human. Instead, Daniel saw how Victor operated, skimming wages, falsifying safety reports, pushing men into dangerous situations to meet quotas. Jackson poured more coffee, his hands steady despite the anger building in his gut. When did Daniel figure it out? 6 months before the collapse. Emma's voice went flat, the way people's voices went when they recounted trauma so often it lost emotional texture. He found the real ledgers, the ones Victor kept hidden, cross-referenced them with what the mining company received. The numbers didn't match. Daniel confronted Victor privately, told him he had 1 week to confess or Daniel would go to the territorial authorities. Jackson could see where this was going. And Victor couldn't let that happen. The tunnel collapsed 5 days later. Emma set Grace down gently, her hands trembling. 32 men went in that morning. 14 came out. Daniel wasn't one of them. Victor was distraught, or he seemed to be. Gave a beautiful eulogy about his brother's sacrifice, about how mining was dangerous work, and sometimes the mountain took its due. But you didn't believe it. Emma's laugh held no humor. I believed it for about a month, until I started going through Daniel's papers trying to settle his affairs. Found his notes hidden in a book, everything documented. Dates, amounts, names of miners Victor had threatened. Found the real ledgers Daniel had copied. Found letters he'd written to the territorial governor unsent because he died before he could mail them. Jackson felt cold settle in his bones that had nothing to do with winter. And when Victor found out, you knew. He came to me with condolences and forged documents saying Daniel had signed over his share of our house, his savings, everything. Said Daniel owed the family money from some business venture. Emma's voice went hard. But I'd watched Daniel sign our marriage certificate, seen his signature 100 times. The documents Victor showed me were forgeries and not even good ones. So you refused to sign. So I refused. And then my barn burned down. Week later, someone poisoned our well. Week after that, Victor showed up with social workers, said I was an unfit mother, that I was mentally unstable, that the children needed to be placed in his custody for their own safety. Jesus. Jackson set his cup down too hard, coffee sloshing over the rim. I ran that night, packed what we could carry, took the children, and ran. Emma's eyes met his. We've been running ever since. Kansas, Nebraska, Wyoming, now Montana. Every time I think we've gotten far enough, Victor appears. He's got connections. Money, that badge that makes people believe him instead of me. Annie spoke up from across the room, her voice tight. He's obsessed, not just with covering up what he did, with owning Emma, controlling her, proving he won. Jackson looked between them, in understanding dawning. This wasn't just about silencing a witness. This was about power, about a man who couldn't tolerate defiance, who saw Emma's refusal as a personal insult that needed punishing. The cabin door rattled suddenly, a sharp knock that made everyone jump. Annie moved instantly, positioning herself between the door and the younger children. Emma's face went white. Jackson grabbed the rifle and approached slowly, thumb on the hammer. Through the window, he could see two figures on horseback, familiar shapes despite the years. He lowered the rifle and opened the door. Pastor Nathan Gray stood on the porch, his breath misting in cold air, Doc Foster beside him with medical bags slung over his shoulder. Jackson, Nathan said, removing his hat. Been meaning to come by. Heard you had company. Word travels fast. Doc Foster gestured toward the barn. Martha Jenkins came into town yesterday saying she saw children's clothes hanging on your fence. Caused quite a stir at the general store. Jackson glanced back at the cabin, at Emma frozen by the stove, at Annie's protective stance, at the children watching with fearful eyes. Reckon it would. Nathan's gaze moved past Jackson, taking in the scene with the practiced assessment of someone who'd been tending a flock for 30 years. Mind if we come in colder than a well-digger's backside out here? Jackson considered his options. Sending them away would only fuel gossip. Better to face this head-on, control the narrative before it controlled them. Wipe your feet. Inside, Emma had gathered the children behind her like a mother bear with cubs. Annie stood slightly apart, chin lifted in that defiant way Jackson recognized. Pastor Gray stopped just inside the door, his expression carefully neutral. Ma'am, I'm Pastor Nathan Gray from Copper Creek Community Church. This here's Dr. Samuel Foster. Emma nodded but didn't speak, every muscle in her body radiating tension. Doc Foster set his bags down slowly, movements deliberate and unthreatening. Heard there might be some folks here needing medical attention. Thought I'd offer my services. We're fine. Emma's voice came out harder than necessary. Grace piped up from behind her mother's skirt, her child's honesty cutting through adult pretense. Mama had a fever and her head was bleeding. Mr. Kane fixed it. Emma's face flushed, but Doc Foster just smiled gently. Mind if I take a look anyway, ma'am? Just to be sure nothing is festering. Infections got a way of sneaking up on folks. Emma hesitated, her eyes finding Jackson's across the room. He gave a slight nod. She exhaled slowly. Fine, but the children stay with me. Wouldn't have it any other way. While the doctor examined Emma's wounds with gentle efficiency, Pastor Gray settled into a chair near the fire, accepting the coffee Jackson offered. The town's talking, Nathan said quietly. Town's always talking. They're saying you've taken up with a stranger, a woman traveling with 5 children who don't all look related to each other or to her. Nathan paused. They're saying you've lost your mind with grief. Jackson sat across from him, his jaw tight. And what are you saying? Nathan was quiet for a moment, studying Jackson's face with the intensity of someone who'd known him for years, who'd performed his wedding and presided over Sarah's funeral and watched him disappear into himself in the aftermath. I'm saying that in the 3 years since Sarah passed, I've watched you bury yourself while still breathing. Stopped coming to church. Stopped coming to town unless you had no choice. I've buried a lot of men in my time, Jackson, but watching you bury yourself alive, that was harder than most funerals. I didn't ask for your concern. No, you didn't ask for much of anything. That was the problem. Nathan leaned forward. Now I come out here expecting to find some sordid situation. Maybe a woman taking advantage of your loneliness, and instead I find children playing in your yard and real life happening in this cabin for the first time in 3 years. Jackson said nothing, but something in his chest tightened. I'm not here to judge, Nathan continued. I'm here to understand, and maybe to warn you. Warn me about what? There's been a man in town. Arrived 2 days ago. Big fellow badge on his chest asking questions about a woman traveling with children. Nathan's expression grew serious. Says she's wanted for theft and abandonment of family obligations. Says he's got legal papers to take her into custody. Across the room, Emma had gone rigid. Doc Foster paused in his examination, looking between them. He gave a name. Jackson kept his voice level. Shaw. Victor Shaw. Claims to be sheriff of Ridgeway County. Nathan's eyes moved to Emma. Says the woman he's looking for is named Emma Reed. Emma stood slowly, Grace clutching her skirt. That's me, and he's a liar. Nathan raised an eyebrow. That's a serious accusation, ma'am. It's the truth. Emma stepped forward, her fear transforming into something fiercer. Victor Shaw killed his own brother, my husband, because Daniel was going to expose him for stealing from minors. He forged documents to steal everything Daniel built. And when I wouldn't sign over what little we had left, he burned my barn and poisoned my well. You have proof of these accusations. Emma's hands clenched into fists. I have Daniel's letters detailing what Victor was doing. I have his real signature to compare against Victor's forgeries. I have the names of 3 minors who saw Victor enter that tunnel the day it collapsed. She paused. What I don't have is a badge or connections or money to make people listen. The cabin fell silent. Doc Foster had stopped any pretense of examining Emma's wounds, his full attention on the conversation. Annie watched from her position near the children, her young face older than it should be. Pastor Gray studied Emma for a long moment, then turned to Jackson. You believe her? I do. Why? Because a woman who walks through a blizzard with 5 children doesn't do it for money or revenge. Jackson held his old friend's gaze. She does it for survival, and survival don't need to lie. Nathan absorbed this, his expression unreadable. After what felt like an hour but was probably 30 seconds, he nodded slowly. Victor Shaw is staying at Martha Jenkins' boarding house. He's been showing your photograph around, ma'am, offering a reward for information. Emma's face went white as ash. Then we have to leave. Tonight, before in this weather, Doc Foster interjected. Ma'am, another storm's coming in by nightfall. You wouldn't make it 5 miles before the children froze. Then what do you suggest? Emma's voice cracked. Wait here for him to find us. Let him take the children. Let him. I'm suggesting, Nathan said carefully, that running hasn't worked so far. Maybe it's time to try something different. Like what? Stand and fight a man with a badge and a gun and the law on his side. The law isn't on his side if what you say is true. Nathan stood, moving toward her. It's only on his side because no one's challenged it yet. He paused. I'm asking you to trust us, Mrs. Reed. Trust this town. Emma stared at him like he'd suggested she trust a rabid dog. You don't know what you're asking. I'm asking you to trust that most people, when they see a mother protecting her children from a dangerous man, will choose to do what's right. Nathan's voice softened. I've spent 20 years shepherding these folks. They gossip, they judge, but when it matters, when someone truly needs them, most of them find a way to be decent. Most isn't all. No, but most is enough. Emma looked at her children huddled together near the fire. Grace's face showed fear. Ben's showed confusion. Tommy was too young to understand fully, but old enough to sense danger. Marcus stood with his fists clenched, ready to fight or flee. And Annie's face held skepticism, worn smooth by experience, the look of someone who'd been promised safety before and found only betrayal. What would trusting you look like? Emma finally asked. Nathan exchanged a glance with Doc Foster. There's a church social this Sunday. The whole town attends. It would be a chance for folks to meet you properly, see you and the children as people instead of rumors. You want me to walk into a room full of strangers who've been hearing lies about me. I want to give you a chance to tell your truth before Victor controls the narrative. Nathan's voice grew earnest. He can flash his badge and spin his stories, but he can't control what people see with their own eyes. Give them something to see, Mrs. Reed, Emma turned to Jackson, her expression raw and uncertain. What do you think? He'd been quiet through the exchange, letting the conversation unfold, but now all eyes were on him, and he had to choose encourage her to run again, to keep fleeing until they ran out of places to hide, or convince her to stand and face the fire. I think Pastor Gray is right about one thing. Jackson's voice came out rougher than intended. Running hasn't worked. You've been running for weeks, and Victor's still 2 days behind you. Another few weeks, and he'll be 1 day behind, then hours, then right behind you, with nowhere left to go. So you think I should stay and fight? I think you should stay and stand. There's a difference. He moved closer, lowering his voice. Fighting is what Victor wants. He's got the guns and the badge and the muscle to win a fight. But standing, making people see you know you care about you, that's something he can't beat with bullets. Emma's eyes searched his face. And if it doesn't work, if the town sides with him, then we'll figure something else out. But at least we'll have tried. Emma repeated the words slowly. You keep saying that. I know what I said. Something passed between them, an understanding that went deeper than words, a recognition that they were both people who'd lost everything and found themselves somehow improbably in each other's orbit. Jackson saw the moment Emma made her decision, saw her spine straighten and her jaw set. She turned back to Pastor Gray. Sunday. We'll be there. Nathan's face relaxed into something like relief. I'll prepare the congregation. Doc, you'll vouch for what you've seen here today? Foster nodded, a mother with 5 children recovering from injury under the protection of a good man. I'll vouch for that and more. Then we have 3 days to get ready. Nathan retrieved his hat from the table. Mrs. Reed, I don't know what brought you to Copper Creek, but I believe there's a reason you ended up here. Sometimes the Lord works through blizzards and barns and stubborn ranchers. For the first time since the men arrived, Emma almost smiled. I hope you're right, Pastor. So do I, ma'am. So do I. After they left, the cabin felt smaller somehow, the weight of what had been decided pressing against the walls. Annie approached Emma with fire in her eyes. You can't be serious. A church social. With all those people staring at us, judging us with Victor, probably waiting right outside. It's a chance, Annie. The first real chance we've had since we left Ridgeway. It's a trap, Annie's voice cracked. That preacher doesn't know you. He doesn't care. He just wants to feel good about himself helping the poor widow and her orphan children. That's enough. No, it's not enough. Nothing is ever enough. Annie's composure shattered. We had a chance in Silver Falls and it fell apart. We had a chance in Dusty Creek and it fell apart. Every time someone says, trust me, it falls apart, and we end up running again with nothing but the clothes on our backs. Emma reached for her, but Annie pulled away. I'm not a fool, Ma. I see how you look at him. She gestured toward Jackson. You want this to work because you want to stop running, because you want, what do I want, Annie? A home, Annie's voice broke. A husband. Someone to take care of you so you don't have to be strong every single second of every single day. Emma's face crumpled. For a moment, she looked as young and vulnerable as any of the children. Is that so wrong? She whispered. Is it so wrong to want to rest? Annie's anger faltered. No, it's not wrong. It's just, I don't want to see you hurt again. I don't want to see any of us hurt again. Emma gathered Annie into her arms, holding tight even as the girl resisted, then slowly, incrementally relaxed into the embrace. I know, sweetheart. I know. But we can't live our whole lives afraid. At some point, we have to take a chance on something, on someone. And you think he's worth the chance? Elijah. Emma pulled back, holding Annie at arm's length. I think he's the first man in a very long time who's asked for nothing and given everything. I think he's carrying his own grief, and instead of letting it make him hard, he's let it make him kind. She paused. That's rare, Annie, and rare things are worth protecting. Annie wiped her eyes with the back of her hand. I still don't trust the pastor. You don't have to. You just have to trust me. A long moment passed. Then Annie nodded once. Okay, Ma, Sunday. But if things go wrong, we run. Together. Like always. Promise, promise. The door opened, bringing a gust of cold air. Jackson stepped inside, stamping snow from his boots. He took in the scene, Emma and Annie standing close, the other children watching with wide eyes, and said nothing, simply moving to the fire to warm his hands. That night, after the children were asleep and the cabin had settled into quiet, Emma found Jackson on the porch, wrapped in his heavy coat, watching stars emerge through breaks in the clouds. Mind if I join you? He shifted to make room on the bench, and she settled beside him close enough that their shoulders almost touched. You didn't have to do that today. Stand by me. Vouch for me. You barely know me. I know enough. She turned to look at him, her breath misting in cold air. What if you're wrong? What if I'm exactly what Victor says I am? I'm not wrong. Emma shook her head, something between exasperation and wonder in her expression. It can't be that simple. Why not? Because nothing in my life has ever been that simple. There's always a catch, always a price, always something waiting to fall apart. Jackson was quiet for a moment, then reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a worn leather pouch. He opened it carefully, revealing a lock of hair tied with faded ribbon. Sarah, he cut this for me the week before she passed. Said she wanted me to have something to hold on to when she was gone. Emma's throat tightened. For 3 years, I've been holding on to that hair like it was all I had left of her. Jackson's voice roughened. Like letting go of it meant letting go of everything we were together. But lately I've been thinking maybe that's not what she would have wanted. What do you mean she was practical, my Sarah? Stubborn as a mole and twice as opinionated. If she could see me now alone, bitter talking to her grave every Sunday like she could hear me, she'd knock me upside the head and tell me to stop being a fool. Emma almost smiled. She sounds remarkable. She was. Jackson turned to face her fully. And she would have liked you. Would have loved you for how you protect those children, how you give them the last of your food and the warmest spot by the fire. Emma's eyes filled with tears she refused to let fall. I'm scared. I've been scared for so long. I've forgotten what it feels like to be anything else. I know. And Sunday walking into that church facing all those people, I don't know if I can do it. You won't be doing it alone. She looked at him, really looked, taking in the lines of his face, the silver at his temples, the steadiness in his gaze that hadn't wavered once. Why? Why are you doing all this? Because when I found you in that barn half dead, holding on to those children like they were all that mattered, I saw something I recognized. Jackson's voice dropped. I saw someone who'd lost everything and was still fighting. And for the first time since Sarah died, I felt like maybe there was something worth fighting for again. You don't owe me anything. I know. Jackson took her hand in his rough palm warm against her cold fingers. But I choose this. I choose you. All of you. For as long as you'll let me. Emma stared at their joined hands, watching her own fingers tremble. I don't know if I can love anyone again. Daniel losing him nearly destroyed me. I don't know if there's enough left of me to give. I'm not asking for everything. I'm just asking you to let me stand beside you. The rest can come whenever it comes, or never. That's up to you. She looked up at him, this quiet man who'd opened his door to strangers and asked nothing in return. Okay, she whispered. Okay, I'll let you stand beside me. And maybe she squeezed his hand. Maybe I'll see what else I can find to offer along the way. That's enough for me. They sat together in the cold hands intertwined, watching the stars wheel overhead. In 3 days, they would face the town. In 3 days, everything could fall apart or finally come together. But tonight, there was only this two wounded souls finding shelter in each other and the faint flickering hope that maybe, just maybe, they had finally stopped running. Inside, Annie stood at the window watching them. She saw their joined hands, the way Emma's head tilted toward Jackson's shoulder, the stillness that had settled over them like a blessing. For the first time in months, she didn't feel the overwhelming urge to run. She felt something else instead, something fragile and unfamiliar, that she was almost afraid to name. She felt like maybe they'd found a place to belong. The next morning, Jackson woke to find a dead rabbit on his porch. Its throat had been cut clean, the wound precise and professional. Beneath its body lay a folded paper, the ink barely dried, despite the cold. Last warning. Jackson picked up the note, his jaw tightening as he read it. Victor Cross had found them. The clock was ticking now, 3 days compressed into hours, and the storm gathering on the horizon had nothing to do with weather and everything to do with a man who believed his badge made him God. Jackson burned the note in the stove without showing Emma. Some threats didn't need words to be understood. Victor was coming, and when he arrived, someone's world would end. Jackson just had to make sure it wasn't theirs. Sunday morning arrived with a sky the color of old bone and cold that cut through wool like paper. Emma stood before the small mirror in Jackson's bedroom, her fingers trembling as she fastened the buttons of the blue dress he'd given her, another of Sarah's altered to fit her narrower frame. The woman staring back looked like a stranger, clean and pressed and terrified in equal measure. Grace appeared in the doorway, her hair brushed smooth for the first time in weeks, wearing a dress Martha Jenkins had sent over yesterday with a note that read simply, "For the girl, no judgment, no conditions, just fabric and thread in an act of kindness from a woman Emma had never met." "Are we really going to church?" Grace's voice was small and certain. "We are, sweetheart." "Will there be other children there?" "I expect so." Grace's face brightened, then clouded. "What if they don't like us?" Emma knelt down, taking her daughter's small hands. "Then we'll know they're not worth worrying about. But I think you might be surprised. Most children are curious, not cruel. That's not what Annie says. Annie's had harder experiences than most. But that doesn't mean everyone is unkind." Emma kissed Grace's forehead, tasting fear and hope in equal measure on her own lips. "Now go tell the others it's time to leave." Grace scampered off, her footsteps light on the wooden floor, and Emma turned back to the mirror. Her hands were still shaking. 3 days since Pastor Gray's visit, 3 days of preparation that felt like 3 years, and now the moment had arrived, and she wanted nothing more than to run to grab the children and disappear into the wilderness, where Victor's reach couldn't find them. "You look beautiful." She spun to find Jackson in the doorway, dressed in his Sunday best, a dark coat that had seen better days, but was brushed clean, a white shirt buttoned to the collar. He held his hat in his hands, turning it slowly by the brim, and something in his eyes made her breath catch. "I look terrified." "Those ain't mutually exclusive," despite everything she almost smiled. "Is the wagon ready?" "Been ready since dawn. Children are loaded up and wrapped in every blanket we own." He stepped closer, his voice dropping. "You don't have to do this. We can turn around right now. Tell Pastor Gray we changed our minds. And then what, hide here forever waiting for Victor to find us? There are worse fates than hiding with people who care about you." Emma reached out and touched his face, her palm against his weathered cheek. "You've given me so much already. A roof, safety, hope. I won't repay that by turning you into a fugitive. If we're going to face this, we face it proper." Jackson covered her hand with his own. Together, together. The ride to Copper Creek took nearly an hour, the wagon wheels cutting through snow that had crusted over in the night cold. Emma sat in the back with the children, Tommy curled in her lap, Grace pressed against her side. Ben and Marcus sat stiff and silent, their eyes scanning the tree line like they expected trouble to emerge at any moment. Annie sat up front beside Jackson, her jaw set, her hands folded tight in her lap. "You ever been to a church social?" Jackson's voice was casual, but Emma could hear the effort behind it. Annie was quiet for a moment. "Once. Before my folks died. Remember anything about it? I remember there was apple, I think, and someone played fiddle, and my pa danced with my ma in the corner where they thought no one could see." Her voice softened. She was laughing. "I remember that most, the sound of her laugh." Jackson nodded slowly. "My Sarah loved to dance. Said I had 2 left feet in the rhythm of a fence post, but she dragged me onto the floor anyway. Said it wasn't about being good. It was about being together." "Do you miss her?" Annie's question came out barely a whisper. Every day, every day. Does it ever stop hurting?" "It changes. The sharp edges wear down, become something you can carry instead of something that cuts. But it never disappears entirely." He glanced at her. "Wouldn't want it to, I reckon. The pain means it mattered." Annie absorbed this in silence, her young face serious. Then almost reluctantly, "Emma's good. Better than she knows. She didn't have to take me in. I know. If something happens today, if that man shows up and things go bad, nothing's going to happen. But if it does," Annie turned to look at him, her eyes fierce, "you get her out. You get Ben and Grace and Tommy out. Marcus and me, we can take care of ourselves." Jackson held her gaze. "I promise that if things go bad, we all get out together. That's the only promise I'm making." Annie opened her mouth to argue, then stopped. Something in her expression shifted, not softened exactly, but eased. "You really mean that, don't you, the together part?" "I don't say things I don't mean. Haven't got the energy for it." For the first time since he'd met her, Annie's lips curved into something that might have been a smile. "Emma was right about you. You're not like the others." "What others?" "All of them. Every man who ever looked at her and saw something to use instead of someone to protect." They reached Copper Creek just as the church bells began to ring. The town was small, a main street lined with wooden buildings, a general store, a blacksmith shop, a boarding house with a sign that creaked in the wind. People milled about on the church steps, their breath rising in white clouds as they greeted neighbors and stamped warmth into their feet. And every single one of them turned to stare as Jackson's wagon rolled into view. Emma felt the weight of their gazes like a physical thing pressing against her chest, stealing her breath. She straightened her spine, lifted her chin, and refused to look away. Let them look. Let them judge. She had walked through worse than gossip. Mama, Grace's whisper was urgent, frightened. They're all looking at us. Let them look. Emma's voice came out steadier than she felt. We have nothing to hide. Jackson pulled the wagon to a stop near the church steps and climbed down, circling around to help Emma descend. His hands were steady as she took them, his grip firm and reassuring. The children followed Ben, helping Tommy Annie, keeping a protective arm around Grace Marcus, bringing up the rear with his fists clenched at his sides. Pastor Gray appeared at the church entrance, his face creased with something that might have been concern or relief or both. Mrs. Reed, I'm glad you came. You gave me little choice, Pastor. I gave you an opportunity. What you do with it is entirely up to you. He turned to the gathered crowd, raising his voice. Friends, I'd like you to meet Emma Reed and her children. They're guests at Cane Ranch, and I expect you'll treat them with the same Christian charity you'd show any stranger in need. The crowd murmured, a low rumble of voices that Emma couldn't quite parse. She caught fragments, vagrant scandal, shame, but also other words, softer ones. Poor things, so many children, look how thin they are. A woman pushed forward from the crowd, silver hair pinned beneath a severe bonnet, eyes sharp as broken glass. She stopped directly in front of Emma and looked her up and down with an assessment that felt like judgment and curiosity braided together. You're the one everyone's been talking about. The woman's voice was flat, unreadable. Emma met her gaze without flinching. I expect I am. They say you were running from the law. They say you stole from family. They say a lot of things. Most of them aren't true. The woman's eyes narrowed. And what is true, Mrs. Reed? Emma felt the crowd pressing in, felt their judgment wrapping around her like a shroud. She could lie, could deflect, could play the meek widow, and hope their pity outweighed their suspicion. But she was tired of pretending, tired of shrinking herself small to fit other people's expectations. What's true is that my husband was murdered by his own brother. Emma's voice came out clear and strong, despite her racing heart. What's true is that same brother forged documents to steal everything my husband worked for. What's true is that when I refused to let him take what little we had left, he made my life so dangerous I had no choice but to run. The crowd went silent, the kind of silence that felt like held breath. What's true is that I walked through a blizzard with 5 children, 3 of whom aren't even mine by blood, because someone had to protect them, and there was no one else willing to do it. Emma's voice rose, years of fear and frustration pouring out. What's true is that Jackson Kane opened his door to us when we had nowhere else to go, and he asked for nothing in return. She looked around at the gathered faces, some hostile, some curious, some touched with something that might have been compassion. I'm not asking you to like me. I'm not asking you to trust me. I'm only asking you to see us as people trying to survive in a world that hasn't made it easy. The woman stared at Emma for a long moment, and Emma prepared herself for rejection, for the crowd to turn away, for this gamble to fail, as spectacularly as every other attempt at finding sanctuary. But then the woman's face shifted, something like respect flickering across her features. That took courage, Mrs. Reed. The woman's voice softened almost imperceptibly. I've seen grown men buckle under less scrutiny. I don't have the luxury of buckling, ma'am. I have children depending on me. Something shifted in the woman's expression, some calculation being made behind those sharp eyes. Call me Martha, and welcome to Copper Creek. She turned and walked into the church without another word, and slowly, hesitantly, others began to follow. Jackson appeared at Emma's side. That was something. That was terrifying. Same thing sometimes. He offered his arm. Shall we? Emmy took a breath, then another, looking down at her children. Grace's hopeful face, Ben's worried frown, Annie's guarded eyes, Marcus's defensive stance, Tommy's innocent confusion. They were watching her, waiting to see if she would falter, if this would be another place they'd have to flee from. Yes, let's go. The church interior was warm with body heat and candle flame. Pews lined both sides of a narrow aisle, and at the front, Pastor Gray stood behind a simple wooden pulpit. The congregation settled in their whispers, gradually fading to silence as the service began. Emma sat in the back pew with the children, Jackson solid and steady beside her. She tried to focus on the pastor's words, something about mercy, about welcoming strangers, about the better angels of human nature, but her attention kept drifting to the faces around her. Some were openly hostile. A woman in the third row kept turning to glare, her lips pressed thin with disapproval. A man near the front shook his head slowly each time the pastor mentioned compassion, as if the very concept offended him. But others were different. Doc Foster caught her eye and nodded reassuringly. A young mother with a toddler on her lap offered a tentative smile. An elderly man in overalls studied the children with something that looked almost like tenderness. Then the church door opened. Cold air rushed in, cutting through the warmth like a blade, and every head turned toward the entrance. Emma's blood turned to ice in her veins, her hand instinctively reaching for Tommy, pulling him closer. Victor Cross stood in the doorway. He was bigger than Emma remembered, broader through the shoulders, his presence filling the entrance like a wall. His badge glinted on his chest, catching the candlelight, and his coat hung open to reveal the gun at his hip. He removed his hat slowly, deliberately, his eyes scanning the congregation until they found her. His smile was a blade. Well, isn't this a touching scene? Beside Emma, Jackson tensed, his hand moving toward his side where a gun would normally rest. But he'd left it in the wagon, had refused to bring a weapon into church, and now Emma could see the regret flickering across his face. Pastor Gray stepped down from the pulpit, his voice firm. "Sheriff Cross, this is a house of worship, and I'm a man of the law, Pastor." Victor's voice carried through the silent church, smooth as oil, dangerous as poison. The two don't have to be mutually exclusive. He walked slowly down the aisle, his boots heavy on the wooden floor, each step measured and deliberate. Emma felt her breath coming faster, felt panic rising in her throat like bile. Around her, the children pressed closer. Annie's hand finding hers, Ben wrapping his arms around Tommy, Grace burying her face in Emma's side. "I've been looking for Mrs. Reed here for quite some time." Victor stopped a few feet from their pew, his gaze never leaving Emma's face. "She's wanted in Ridgeway for theft and abandonment of family obligations." He paused, letting the words settle over the congregation like snow. "Now I can do this the easy way or the hard way. You can come with me peacefully, let the proper authorities sort this out." "Those are lies." Emma's voice came out steadier than she felt, years of fear transforming into something harder, something that tasted like rage. "That's for a court to decide, isn't it?" Victor's smile widened. "Now I have papers, I have authority, I have the legal right to take this woman into custody." Jackson rose to his feet, placing himself between Victor and Emma. "Or what? You'll drag her out of church in front of all these witnesses. I'll do what the law requires, Mr. Kane." Victor's gaze shifted to Jackson, assessing, calculating. "I have the badge, I have the authority, and who might you be to her husband, guardian? Or just some lonely fool she's using until she moves on to the next mark?" Emma felt rage flood through her, hot and cleansing. She stood pushing past Jackson, facing Victor with every ounce of strength she had left. "You want to talk about authority? Let's talk about how you used yours, how you stole from minors, how you falsified safety reports, how you murdered your own brother because he was going to expose you." Gasps rippled through the congregation, shock registering on face after face. Victor's expression hardened, the mask of civility cracking. "Careful, Emma. Slander's a serious offense. It's not slander if it's true. You killed Daniel, your own blood. You collapsed that tunnel knowing he was inside, knowing 32 men were inside, because you couldn't let him tell the truth about what you'd been doing. You have proof of these accusations." Victor's voice dropped, became something dangerous. "I have Daniel's letters. I have his real signature to compare against your forgeries. I have the names of miners who saw you enter that tunnel the day it collapsed." Emma stepped closer, her fear burning away in the face of fury she'd been carrying for 2 years. "You have Thomas's blood on your hands, and you've been chasing me because dead wives don't testify." The church erupted in whispers, people turning to their neighbors, shock and confusion spreading through the pews like wildfire. Victor's mask slipped completely, and for a moment Emma saw the rage beneath the cold calculation, the absolute certainty that he deserved to take what he wanted and destroy anyone who stood in his way. Then Victor spoke, and his voice was quiet, intimate, meant only for Emma's ears, but carrying in the shocked silence. Do you remember what I told you the night Daniel died, when I came to your house with condolences and flowers? Emma felt her knees weaken, memory flooding back. Victor standing on her porch, his face a mask of grief, his words soft and sympathetic, while his eyes held something else entirely. I told you I'd always take care of you, that Daniel would have wanted that. Victor took another step closer. I told you that you and we could honor his memory together, make something good come from tragedy. The congregation didn't understand, couldn't see what Emma saw in his face, the obsession, the possessiveness, the twisted belief that he had some claim on her, some right to her body and her life and her future. And you know what you said to me? Victor's voice turned bitter. You said you'd rather die alone than accept help from me. Said you'd rather starve in the street than let me into your house. Do you remember that, Emma? Because you killed him, Emma's voice broke. Because I knew what you'd done. Victor's hand moved to his gun, and several people in the congregation gasped. Jackson tensed, ready to move, but Emma held up a hand. Go ahead. Emma's voice came out clear despite the tears streaming down her face. Shoot me right here, right now, and prove everything I've been saying about you. Show all these people exactly what kind of man wears that badge. The moment stretched thin as wire, ready to snap. Victor's finger rested on the grip of his gun, his chest rising and falling with rapid breaths. The entire church held its breath, waiting to see if this would end in blood, in gunfire, or something else entirely. Then Martha Jenkins stood up from her pew in the third row, her voice cut through the tension like a bell. Sheriff Cross, I knew your brother. Victor's gaze snapped to her, confusion flickering across his face. Ma'am, Daniel Cross. Martha walked forward slowly, her cane tapping against the wooden floor. He came to my boarding house 6 months before he died. Said he needed a place to think away from the mine, away from his brother. Said he had evidence of corruption he was planning to report. The congregation stirred, whispers rising again. He showed me the ledgers. Martha continued, her voice steady and clear. Showed me the real numbers versus what was being reported. Showed me the safety violations that had been covered up. She paused. He asked me to hold on to copies, said if anything happened to him, I should give them to the territorial authorities. Victor's face had gone white. You're lying. I'm a 72-year-old widow with a boarding house and a reputation for honesty that's lasted 50 years in this town. Martha's eyes were hard as flint. Why would I lie? Because she, Victor gestured at Emma, because she's gotten to you somehow, poisoned you against me. She showed up 3 days ago half dead in a blizzard. Martha's voice rose. I've had those documents for 2 years, Sheriff, locked in my safe waiting for the right moment. She turned to face the congregation, waiting for someone brave enough to speak the truth about what happened in that mine. The church erupted, people rising from their pews, voices overlapping, shock and anger and confusion, braiding together into something that felt like justice trying to be born. Victor looked around wildly, seeing control slip away, seeing the narrative he'd crafted so carefully beginning to crumble. This isn't over. His voice was raw, desperate. You think you've won. You think any of this matters. I have connections. I have authority. You have nothing. Jackson's voice cut through the chaos. You had power built on lies and fear, and now people see you for what you are. Victor's gaze swung to Jackson, and Emma saw murder in his eyes. Saw him calculating whether he could shoot his way out of this church, whether he could silence everyone who'd heard Martha's testimony. His hand twitched toward his gun. Don't, Doc Foster spoke from his pew, his voice calm but carrying authority of its own. There are 40 witnesses here, Sheriff. Whatever you do next, we'll all remember. Every newspaper from here to San Francisco will print the story. Victor's hand hovered over his weapon, the moment stretching impossibly thin. Then slowly his shoulders dropped. This isn't over, he repeated, but the fire had gone out of his voice, replaced by something hollow. I'll be back, with proper warrants, proper authority. You'll all answer for this. He turned and walked back down the aisle, his boots echoing in the silence. At the doorway he paused and looked back at Emma. I loved my brother. His voice cracked. Whatever you think of me, I loved him. Then why did you kill him? Emma's question was simple, devastating. Victor had no answer. He left the door slamming shut behind him and the church exploded into conversation. Emma's knees gave out. Jackson caught her before she hit the ground, sweeping her up as the congregation gasped and surged forward. "Doc, she's fainted. Bring her to the vestry." Foster pushed through the crowd. "Everyone back. Give her air. Give her space." Emma tried to protest, tried to say she was fine, but her voice wouldn't cooperate. The edges of her vision blurred, sounds fading to a distant hum. She felt Jackson's arms around her, heard his voice murmuring reassurances she couldn't quite make out. The last thing she saw before darkness took her was Annie's face, fierce and afraid and proud all at once. "You did it, Ma." Her voice seemed to come from very far away. "You did it." Then everything went quiet. When Emma woke, she was lying on a narrow cot in a small room, afternoon light filtering through a single window. Jackson sat beside her, his hand wrapped around hers, his face lined with worry. "Welcome back." She tried to sit up. He eased her back down. "Easy. Doc says you're exhausted." Body finally gave out after weeks of running on nothing but fear and stubbornness. "The children are fine." Martha Jenkins took them to her house for lunch. They're being fed more pie than any child should reasonably consume. A ghost of a smile touched his lips. "Annie's probably suspicious of the kindness, but Grace is in heaven." Emma almost laughed, but it came out as a sob instead. "Hey," Jackson's voice softened. "Hey, it's all right. You did something incredible today. You stood up to him. You got people to listen. And now he's going to come back angrier than before. Probably. But he'll be coming back against a town that's watching a town that's asking questions." Jackson squeezed her hand. "That's different than coming back against a woman alone." Emma turned her head to look at him, at this man who'd given her shelter and safety, and something that felt dangerously like hope. In the church, when Victor reached for his gun, why didn't you draw on him? Because that's what he wanted. A reason to shoot, a justification for violence. Jackson's jaw tightened. "I wasn't going to give him that. He could have killed you. He could have tried. But killing a man in front of a church full of witnesses is different than killing a man in a collapsed mine tunnel. Even Victor Cross knows that." Emma was quiet for a moment, processing everything that had happened. The confrontation, the revelations, Martha's testimony. Victor's face when he realized he'd lost control of the narrative. "What happens now?" "Now we wait. Pastor Gray's sending word to the territorial judge in Helena. If your evidence is as strong as you say, there'll be an investigation. Victor won't be able to sweep this under the rug anymore. And if the judge is in Victor's pocket, then we find another way." Jackson leaned closer. "But we don't stop fighting. You hear me, Emma? We don't stop." She reached up and touched his face, her fingers tracing the line of his jaw. "I'm so tired. I've been fighting for so long, I don't know if I have anything left." "Then rest. Let me carry the weight for a while. I can't ask you to." "You're not asking, I'm offering." He pressed his forehead to hers. "That's what this is, Emma. That's what we are. Two people who've been carrying too much alone, finally finding someone to share the load." Tears slipped down her temples into her hair. "I don't deserve you. That's not how this works. It's not about deserving." Jackson pulled back enough to meet her eyes. "It's about choosing. I choose you. I'll keep choosing you until you tell me to stop. And if I never tell you to stop, then I reckon we've got a lot of choosing ahead of us." She laughed through her tears, and he smiled that rare, genuine smile that transformed his weathered face into something almost young. Okay, I choose you too." He kissed her forehead, gentle as a prayer. "Rest now. We've got a long road ahead." Emma closed her eyes, still holding his hand, and let herself drift. Outside, the day wore on. In Copper Creek, rumors spread faster than wildfire, carrying news of what had happened in the church. And somewhere, Victor Cross plotted his next move. But for now, in this small room with this steady man beside her, Emma felt something she'd almost forgotten how to feel. She felt safe. That night, Jackson returned to the ranch alone to tend the animals, while Emma and the children stayed at Martha Jenkins' boarding house. He moved through his evening routine on autopilot, feeding the horses, checking the water troughs, securing the barn against wind and cold. The familiar motion soothed something in him, grounded him after the chaos of the day. He was walking back to the cabin when he smelled it. Smoke. Not wood smoke from a chimney, but something thicker, darker wrong. Jackson ran. The barn was engulfed flames, climbing the walls and licking at the roof. His mare screamed from inside, a sound that cut through the night like broken glass. The milk cow bellowed, the chickens shrieked, and Jackson felt his heart drop into his stomach. He grabbed a bucket, filled it from the trough, and ran toward the flames. The heat seared his face, smoke filling his lungs, but he pushed forward, throwing water that evaporated before it even touched wood. Useless. The barn was lost. But the animals, Jackson grabbed a blanket from the fence, soaked it in the trough, wrapped it around his head and shoulders, and ran into the burning structure. The smoke was choking, blinding, but he knew this barn like he knew his own hands. He found the mare's stall, threw it open, slapped her hindquarters. She bolted past him out into the night. The cow was harder. She was panicking, ramming against her stall door. Jackson grabbed her halter, pulled with everything he had, and finally got her moving. She knocked him aside as she fled, but he didn't care. Just get out, get to safety. The chickens, there was no saving the chickens. The coop was already collapsed, flames consuming everything. Jackson stumbled back outside his lungs, burning, his eyes streaming, and watched 3 years of work collapse into ash and ember. On the fence post, he found another note, this one longer. You took what was mine. Now I take what's yours. This is just the beginning. Tell Emma that running only made it worse. Tell her that when I find her again, and I will find her, there won't be witnesses, won't be churches, won't be anyone to hear her scream. Jackson's hands clenched into fists, the note crumpling in his grip. Victor Cross had been here, had walked onto his property, had burned his barn, as a message, as a threat, as a promise of worse to come. Around him, the night pressed in, dark and cold, and full of unspoken danger. In the distance, he heard horses, multiple riders coming fast. Jackson grabbed his rifle and waited. The riders came into view through the smoke, 5 men on horseback, lanterns bobbing in the darkness. Jackson raised his rifle, his finger resting light on the trigger, watching as they approached. Then Pastor Gray's voice cut through the night, clear and familiar. Jackson, it's us. Don't shoot. Jackson lowered the weapon as the riders dismounted. Pastor Graydock Foster, the blacksmith, Thomas Reeves, and 2 farmers Jackson recognized from town, but whose names escaped him in his exhausted state. They took in the burning barn with grim faces, the flickering flames casting dancing shadows across their features. We saw the smoke from town. Gray's voice was tight. Came as fast as we could. It's too late. Jackson's throat was raw from smoke. Barn's gone. Got the mare and the cow out, but the rest, he gestured at the inferno. The rest is ash. The men stood in silence, watching 3 years of Jackson's labor collapse into ruin. Thomas Reeves finally spoke, his blacksmith's voice rough as gravel. This wasn't no accident. No. Jackson handed him the note. Victor Cross was here. Thomas read it, his jaw tightening, then passed it to the others. Each man's face grew darker as they absorbed Victor's words. The naked threat, the promise of Balens to come. We need to get word to Emma. Doc Foster moved toward his horse. She needs to know what happened, needs to decide if she wants to stay or she's not running. Jackson's voice came out harder than he intended. We're done running, all of us. Gray studied him in the firelight, something like approval flickering across his face. Then we'd best get organized. Because if Victor Cross wants a war, he's going to find himself fighting a town instead of one woman. The men stayed through the night, keeping watch while the barn burned down to smoldering ruins. They took turns patrolling the property line, rifles ready, but Victor didn't return. By dawn, the barn was nothing but blackened timber and ash smoke still rising in thin gray columns that reminded Jackson of funeral pyres. Martha Jenkins arrived with the sunrise, Emma and the children packed into her wagon. Emma climbed down before the wheels stopped rolling, her face white, as she took in the destruction. Oh God, Jackson, I'm so sorry. This is my fault. If I hadn't, Jackson caught her hands, stopping the spiral. This is Victor's fault. His choice, his crime, not yours. But he did it because of me, because I wouldn't, Emma. Jackson's voice was firm. You didn't strike the match. You didn't light the fire. You didn't choose any of this. He did. The children gathered around the smoking ruins, their faces reflecting shock and fear in equal measure. Annie's expression had gone flat, shuddered, that look she got when preparing to run. Marcus's fists were clenched so tight his knuckles had gone white. Ben held Tommy close, whispering reassurances the little boy was too young to understand. Grace clung to Emma's skirt, silent tears streaming down her face. We should leave, Annie's voice cut through the morning air. Before he comes back, before he hurts anyone else, we should just go. Go where Emma's question was gentle but firm. Where haven't we already tried? How many more towns before we run out of places to hide? Annie had no answer, but her jaw remained set, her body coiled tight like a spring ready to break. Pastor Gray approached his face lined with exhaustion from the long night. Mrs. Reed, I've sent a rider to Helena. Judge Harrison should receive word by tomorrow night, can be here in 4 days if he pushes hard. 4 days. Emma looked at the destroyed barn, at the smoke still rising at her children's frightened faces. Can we hold out that long? We don't have a choice, Gray's voice softened. But you won't be holding out alone. I've spoken with the town council. Starting today, there'll be men posted on the road watching for Victor or his deputies. Any stranger comes within 5 miles of here will knows about it. You're asking people to risk their lives for us. For strangers. I'm not asking. They're volunteering. Gray gestured toward the men scattered across Jackson's property, some still patrolling, others examining the barn's remains. What Victor did last night, burning a man's livelihood, threatening children that crossed a line. Folks in Copper Creek might gossip and judge, but they don't abide bullies. Especially bullies with badges who think the law gives them permission to terrorize women and children. Thomas Reeves walked over, soot staining his work clothes, his face grim. Found something you need to see. He led them to the fence line on the eastern edge of the property where the snow had been trampled by multiple horses. Boot prints everywhere, at least 4 different sets, maybe more. Jackson knelt, examining the tracks, reading the story they told. They were here for a while. Jackson's voice was tight, watching, waiting for the right moment. His finger traced a line of prints leading toward the barn. One man circled around back while the others kept watch. Professional, coordinated, military training, maybe. Thomas crouched beside him. Or lawmen used to working together. Either way, these ain't amateurs. Emma wrapped her arms around herself against the cold. How many men does Victor have? Doc Foster spoke up from behind them, his voice clinical, factual. Last I heard, he's got 3 deputies in Ridgeway, plus whatever muscle he can hire. But that's assuming they're loyal enough to commit arson for him. Money buys a lot of loyalty. Annie's voice was bitter, especially from men who don't ask questions. They returned to the cabin where Martha had taken over the kitchen with the efficiency of a general planning a campaign. She'd somehow produced enough food to feed everyone biscuits and gravy bacon coffee strong enough to strip paint. The men ate standing up, keeping watch through the windows, while the children sat at the table and tried to act like their world wasn't falling apart around them. Jackson found Emma on the porch, staring out at where the barn had been. She didn't turn when he approached, just spoke to the frozen landscape. Tell me about her. About Sarah. Jackson was quiet for a long moment, organizing thoughts he rarely allowed himself to examine. She was practical, stubborn, had opinions about everything and wasn't shy about sharing them. Sounds like someone I know. Emma's lips quirked slightly. She would have liked you. Would have taken one look at you walking through that blizzard with 5 children and known exactly what kind of person you were. Jackson leaned against the porch rail. After she died, people kept telling me I'd move on eventually. Find someone new. Like love was something you could replace, like one woman was interchangeable with another. Emma turned to face him. But you couldn't. Didn't want to. Felt like moving on meant forgetting, and forgetting felt like betrayal. Jackson met her eyes. But that's not what Sarah would have wanted. She'd have called me a fool for wasting 3 years talking to a grave when there was living to be done. Do you feel like you're betraying her now with me? No, the word came out firm, certain. I feel like I'm finally doing what she asked me to do the night she died. Don't let this make you hard, she said. Don't let losing me turn you into stone. Jackson's voice roughened, but I did anyway, turned hard and cold and stopped letting anyone close. Until you showed up in my barn and reminded me that being hard doesn't mean being strong, and being alone doesn't mean being safe. Emma's eyes filled with tears. I don't know how to do this, how to let someone in again, when letting someone in before cost me everything. You don't have to know how, you just have to be willing to try. She moved closer, her hand finding his. I'm willing, that's all I need. They stood together in the cold morning, 2 people who'd lost everything, learning to believe they might have found something worth keeping. Behind them, through the cabin window, the children ate breakfast under Martha's watchful eye. Around them, men who'd been strangers a week ago stood guard against an enemy who wouldn't stop until he got what he wanted. The siege had begun. That afternoon, wagons started arriving, Families from town bringing lumber nails, tools, supplies. Thomas Reeves brought his entire smithy operation, portable forge, anvil, hammers. Everything needed to fabricate new hardware for the barn they were going to rebuild. Women came with food, with blankets, with offers to watch the children, while Emma and Jackson dealt with the crisis unfolding around them. By sunset, the foundation for a new barn had been laid, and half the frame was up, men working in shifts to take advantage of the remaining daylight. Jackson watched from the porch, overwhelmed by the outpouring of support from people who barely knew him. Martha appeared beside him, 2 cups of coffee in her hands. She offered him one. Community's a funny thing. You can ignore it for years, but when you need it, it comes through. I don't deserve this. Probably not. Martha's voice was matter of fact. But deserves got nothing to do with it. These folks aren't here because you earned their help. They're here because it's the right thing to do. She paused. And because Victor Cross made it personal when he burned your barn, can't let that stand, sets a bad precedent. Jackson almost smiled. You've got a practical view of morality, Martha. 72 years teaches you that morality and practicality ain't as different as philosophers like to claim. Martha sipped her coffee. That woman of yours, Emma, she's tougher than she looks. She's not my woman. Not yet, maybe, but you look at her like she is, and she looks at you the same way. Martha's eyes were sharp. Question is, what are you going to do about it? What can I do? There's a man with a badge and a gun hunting her. Until that's resolved, anything else is putting your life on hold until circumstances are perfect is a good way to run out of life before circumstances cooperate. Martha's voice turned gentle. Sarah wouldn't want you waiting, Jackson. She'd want you living. Jackson had no answer to that, but Martha's words burrowed into his chest and lodged there, uncomfortable and true. That evening, after the workers had gone home and the children were settled, Doc Foster pulled Jackson aside. His face was grave. We need to talk about Victor Cross. What about him? He's not just a corrupt sheriff covering his crimes. Foster's voice dropped. He's a man who lost everything in that mine collapse. His wife, Catherine, was bringing him lunch that day. She was 8 months pregnant. The tunnel collapsed with her inside. Jackson felt ice settle in his gut. Jesus, Victor dug for 3 days straight, trying to reach her. When they finally pulled her out, she'd been dead for hours. The baby, too. Foster's expression was grim. Daniel was the foreman who approved the crew going into that section, despite Victor's concerns about stability. At least, that's what Victor told everyone afterward. Emma said Daniel was going to report Victor for safety violations. That's what Daniel's letters say. But what if they're both telling partial truths? Foster leaned against the fence. What if the section was unstable and Victor knew it, but Daniel sent the crew in anyway because quotas had to be met? What if they're both responsible? But Victor's the only one left alive to carry the guilt. Jackson processed this new information, feeling the situation grow more complicated. You're saying Victor might not be a simple villain. I'm saying that grief and guilt can turn people into monsters without them even realizing it's happening. Foster's voice was quiet. Victor lost his wife, his child, and his brother in one catastrophic event. Maybe he blamed Daniel. Maybe he really believes Daniel was the corrupt one. Maybe the lies he's been telling have become truth in his own mind. That doesn't excuse what he's done. The forged documents, the threats burning my barn. No, it doesn't, but it might explain it. And understanding your enemy is the first step to defeating him. Foster met Jackson's eyes. Victor's not going to stop because he thinks he's right. He thinks he's the one seeking justice. In his mind, Emma's the villain who's keeping him from closing a chapter that's been destroying him for 2 years. Jackson looked toward the cabin, where lamplight glowed warm through the windows. Emma sat inside with Annie, helping the younger children with their letters. She looked up and caught his eye through the glass, offering a small smile that made his chest tight. What do I do with that information? You use it. Foster's voice was firm. When Judge Harrison arrives, you make sure he understands this isn't just about law and evidence. It's about 2 people who both lost someone they loved, both convinced they're in the right, both willing to destroy the other to get justice. Harrison's going to have to untangle which version of truth is real and which is constructed from grief and rage. And if we can't prove Emma's telling the truth, then Victor wins. And Emma spends the rest of her life running, or in prison, or dead. Foster's face was grim. No other options, Jackson. This ends in 4 days when Harrison arrives one way or another. That night, Jackson organized the town volunteers into watches. 6 men at a time stationed around the property in 4-hour shifts. Pastor Gray took the first watch along with Thomas Reeves and 4 farmers, whose names Jackson finally learned: Samuel Porter, James McCarthy, Robert Chen, and Daniel Oakes. Emma tried to help, tried to bring them coffee and food, but Jackson gently insisted she stay inside with the children. Victor's men are out there somewhere. I don't want you visible until Harrison arrives. I hate hiding. It's not hiding. It's tactical patience. Jackson's lips quirked. Sarah used to say the difference between cowardice and wisdom was knowing when to duck. Smart woman, the smartest. Emma touched his face, her palm warm against his cold cheek. Promise me something. Anything. If this goes bad, if Victor somehow wins, if the judge sides with him, promise me you'll get the children out. All of them. Promise me you'll make sure they're safe, even if I'm not there to do it myself. Jackson's throat tightened. Emma, promise me. He wanted to argue, wanted to insist that wouldn't happen, that they'd win, and she'd be safe, and they'd have years together to raise those children. But promises demanded honesty, and honesty meant acknowledging the possibility of failure. I promise, but it won't come to that. She kissed him, then soft and brief and tasting like desperation and hope in equal measure. When she pulled back, her eyes were bright with unshed tears. I'm going to hold you to that. Both parts. The next 3 days passed in tense routine. Men came and went in shifts, the barn rose timber by timber, and life continued in the strange liminal space between crisis and resolution. The children adapted with the resilience of youth. Grace made friends with Samuel Porter's daughter during one of the afternoon watches. Ben learned basic carpentry from Thomas Reeves. Marcus slowly let his guard down enough to smile occasionally. Annie remained suspicious, but Jackson caught her watching him. With Emma saw something calculating in her expression that might have been approval. On the third night, Marcus found him by the unfinished barn, where Jackson was checking the structural integrity of the new frame. Can I ask you something? Jackson straightened, surprised. Marcus had barely spoken to him since arriving, had maintained careful distance, as if worried about getting too comfortable. Course, Marcus shifted his weight, discomfort written across his young face. When Sarah died, did you ever think about just giving up, about letting the grief win? Jackson considered the question carefully. Every day for about a year, then every other day for another year, then just Sundays for a while after that. But you didn't give up, I mean. Some days it was close. Jackson leaned against the barn frame. What made the difference was realizing that living wasn't the same as being alive. I could breathe and eat and sleep and go through motions forever, but that wasn't what Sarah wanted for me. She wanted me to live with all the want and pain and messiness that came with it. Marcus was quiet for a long moment. My stepfather used to tell me I was worthless, that my real father left because he couldn't stand me, that I wasn't worth the food I ate or the space I took up. Jackson felt rage build in his chest, but he kept his voice level. Your stepfather was wrong. How do you know you barely know me? I know Emma wouldn't have taken you in if you were worthless. I know you protect the younger kids without being asked. I know you work harder than anyone gives you credit for. Jackson met the boy's eyes. And I know what it's like to believe the worst things people say about you and forget all the good things you never let yourself hear. Marcus's eyes reddened, but he blinked hard. Emma says we're going to be okay. That Mr. Kane, that you won't let anything happen to us. I'll do everything in my power to keep you safe. Jackson's voice was firm. That's not the same as promising nothing bad will ever happen. Life's got a way of bringing hard things whether we're ready or not. But I can promise you won't face them alone. That's enough. Marcus's voice was thick. That's more than I had before. They stood together in the darkness, man and boy, both carrying wounds that might never fully heal, but had at least stopped bleeding. Above them, stars wheeled across the Montana sky, indifferent and beautiful and constant. On the fourth morning, 2 riders appeared on the eastern ridge. The lookouts called warning, rifles raised, but Jackson recognized one of the horses Pastor Gray's gelding. He lowered his weapon and waited as they approached. Gray dismounted, first, his face grave. Behind him came a man Jackson didn't recognize. 50s, iron gray hair, eyes that missed nothing. He wore a judge's bearing, like a uniform authority radiating from every movement. Jackson Kane. The man's voice was clipped professional. That's me. Judge Marcus Harrison from Helena, I received Pastor Gray's message. I understand there's been trouble. Jackson almost laughed at the understatement. That's one way to put it, Your Honor. Harrison's gaze moved past Jackson to the cabin where Emma had appeared in the doorway, the children clustered behind her. That's Mrs. Reed, yes, sir. And the children, hers. All of them, blood or not. Harrison studied them for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Then he turned back to Jackson. I've reviewed the preliminary evidence Pastor Gray provided, letters, ledgers, witness statements. He paused. I've also received communication from Sheriff Victor Cross detailing his version of events. They don't match. No, sir, they wouldn't. Which creates a problem. Harrison dismounted, his movements deliberate. I'm here to conduct an official hearing. Both parties will present evidence. Both parties will be given opportunity to speak. And then I'll make a determination about how to proceed. He met Jackson's eyes. But I need to be clear about something. If I find that Mrs. Reed is guilty of the charges against her, I'll take her into custody. No amount of community support will change that outcome. The law is the law, understood. Jackson's jaw was tight. Good, then let's proceed. Harrison gestured toward the cabin. I'll need to speak with Mrs. Reed privately first, then examine the evidence she claims to have. After that, I'll hear from Sheriff Cross. Victor's here. Jackson's hand moved instinctively toward his gun. He arrived in town last night, staying at the boarding house under my supervision. Harrison's voice was firm. There will be no confrontations, no violence, no vigilante justice. This will be resolved through proper legal channels or not at all. Jackson wanted to argue, wanted to point out that proper legal channels had failed Emma every time she tried to use them. But Harrison's face made clear that argument would be futile. Yes, sir. The hearing would convene at noon in the church neutral ground where both sides could present their case. Jackson watched Harrison and Gray ride back toward town, then turned to find Emma standing beside him. This is it. Her voice was barely a whisper. Everything comes down to the next few hours. You already know, but I'm doing it anyway. That's what courage looks like. Jackson took her hand, not being unafraid, just being afraid and doing it anyway. She squeezed his fingers. Whatever happens, thank you. For everything, don't talk like it's over. It's not over until Harrison makes his decision, and even then, Jackson. Emma's voice was firm. I need to say this now in case I don't get another chance. You gave me hope when I thought I'd run out. You gave my children safety when no one else would. You stood between us and danger without asking for anything in return. She paused. If this goes bad, if I lose, I need you to know that these past few days were the first time in 2 years I remembered what it felt like to not be afraid every second. You did that. You. Jackson pulled her close, pressing his face into her hair, breathing in the scent of soap and coffee and something uniquely her. I love you. The words came out rough, raw, but true. I didn't plan to, didn't want to risk it, but I do. I love you, Emma Reed. She pulled back just enough to see his face. I love you too. It feels too soon, feels impossible given everything, but I do. They kissed there in the cold morning, surrounded by half-finished barn and watchful men and children who depended on them. They kissed like people who understood that tomorrow was never promised, that now was all anyone ever really had, that love didn't wait for convenient timing. When they broke apart, the sun had fully risen, burning away the morning mist. In 6 hours, Emma would face Victor Cross across a church floor. In 6 hours, a judge would decide her fate and the fate of 5 children who'd already lost too much. But for now, for this stolen moment, they had each other. And against all odds, against every logical reason to despair that felt like enough, the church filled slowly, people arriving in clusters like storm clouds gathering before thunder. Emma sat in the front pew with Jackson on one side and Martha Jenkins on the other. The children arranged behind them in a protective formation that Annie had orchestrated without being asked. The girl had positioned Marcus and Ben on the outside edges herself between Grace and Tommy, creating a barrier of older bodies around the youngest and most vulnerable. Judge Harrison sat behind Pastor Gray's pulpit, transformed now into a makeshift bench, papers spread before him in organized stacks. He'd changed from travel clothes into a black coat that made him look less like a man and more like an instrument of justice itself, cold, impartial, inevitable. The door opened and Victor Cross entered. Emma's breath caught. He looked different than he had 4 days ago, thinner, His eyes hollowed out his badge, no longer gleaming, but dull and tarnished, as if his authority itself had begun to corrode. Two men flanked him, deputies by their bearing, but their faces held uncertainty rather than the swagger Emma had seen in Victor's hired muscle before. Victor's gaze found her immediately, and Emma forced herself not to look away, not to flinch, not to show the fear that still lived in her chest despite everything. His expression was unreadable, not rage, not triumph, just a terrible emptiness that reminded Emma of staring into a well and seeing nothing but darkness at the bottom. Judge Harrison rapped his gavel once the sound cracking through the gathered crowd like a gunshot. This hearing will come to order. His voice carried authority that needed no amplification. We are here to examine evidence and testimony regarding Mrs. Emma Reed, who stands accused of theft and abandonment of family obligations by Sheriff Victor Cross of Ridgway County. Harrison paused, his gaze sweeping the packed church. I want to make clear that this is not a trial. This is a preliminary hearing to determine if sufficient evidence exists to warrant formal charges. Both parties will present their case. Both parties will answer questions. And then I will make a determination about how to proceed. He looked directly at Emma. Mrs. Reed, do you understand? Emma stood, her legs steadier than she'd expected. Yes, Your Honor. Sheriff Cross, do you understand? Victor nodded, once his jaw tight. Then we'll begin with you, Sheriff. Present your case. Victor stood, pulling papers from an inner coat pocket. His hands shook slightly as he unfolded them, and Emma realized with a shock that he was nervous. 2 years ago, my brother Daniel Cross was killed in a mining accident in Ridgway. He left behind his wife Emma and 2 children. As next of kin and executor of Daniel's estate, I attempted to settle his affairs according to his documented wishes. What were those wishes? Harrison's pen moved across paper, taking notes. Daniel had borrowed money from our family from me specifically to purchase his share of the house he lived in with Emma. $1,500, a significant sum. Victor's voice grew steadier as he fell into the rhythm of his story. Before he died, he signed papers acknowledging the debt and agreeing to transfer the property to me if anything happened to him before the debt was repaid. Victor produced documents, passing them to Harrison. The judge examined them carefully, his expression neutral. These appear to be legally executed documents. Harrison looked at Emma. Mrs. Reed, did your husband borrow money from his brother? Emma stood again, forcing her voice to remain calm. No, Your Honor. Daniel never borrowed a cent from Victor. Those documents are forgeries. Can you prove that Emma opened her own folder with hands that trembled despite her best efforts? I have our marriage certificate signed by Daniel. I have letters he wrote to me over the years of our marriage. I have his will executed 2 years before his death. She passed the papers forward. Your Honor, if you compare the signatures, you'll see they're different hands entirely. Harrison studied the documents for what felt like an hour, but was probably 5 minutes. His face gave nothing away. The signatures do appear different. He looked at Victor. Sheriff Cross, can you explain this discrepancy? Victor's face had gone pale. Those were signed when Daniel was ill. His hand was shaking. His signature wasn't steady. It's the same man, just under different circumstances. Daniel wasn't ill when he supposedly signed your documents. Emma's voice cut through the church like a blade. He was at the peak of health, working every day. Your own mining records show he didn't miss a single shift in the 3 months before his death. Harrison made another note. Sheriff Cross, do you have medical records indicating your brother was ill? Victor's jaw worked. No, but then I'm inclined to agree with Mrs. Reed. These appear to be 2 different hands. Harrison set the documents aside. Let's move to the question of the mining accident. Mrs. Reed, you've alleged that your husband's death was not accidental. Explain. Emma's throat tightened, but she pushed forward. Daniel discovered that Victor was stealing from the miners' wages, skimming percentages, falsifying reports to the company, pocketing the difference. She produced another document. This is a copy of the real ledger, the one Daniel made before he confronted Victor. It shows the actual amounts paid versus what was reported. Harrison examined it. And you're saying Sheriff Cross had motive to silence your husband? Daniel told me he was going to report Victor to the territorial authorities. Emma's voice shook. He wrote letters detailing everything. He planned to mail them the day after he died. I have those letters, unsent but dated and signed. She passed them forward, and Harrison read slowly, his expression darkening with each page. These are serious allegations, Sheriff Cross. How do you respond? Victor stood, and Emma saw his mask crack completely. His voice came out raw, damaged. My brother died because he sent 32 men into an unsafe tunnel to meet quotas. I warned him that section wasn't stable. I told him to wait for proper support beams. He ignored me because the company was breathing down his neck about production numbers. That's not true. Emma's voice rose. Daniel kept meticulous safety records. He would never have your honor. Victor's interruption was sharp. May I speak? Harrison nodded once. Daniel wasn't the saint Emma makes him out to be. Victor's hands clenched into fists. He cut corners. He pushed men too hard. And when that tunnel collapsed, it didn't just kill him. It killed my wife, Catherine. She was 8 months pregnant, bringing him lunch, and she died in the rubble because Daniel Cross was too proud to admit he was wrong about structural integrity. The church erupted in whispers, shock rippling through the congregation. Emma felt the ground shift beneath her feet, her certainty cracking. She'd known about Catherine, known Victor had lost his wife, but she'd never considered. You're saying your brother was responsible for your wife's death? Harrison's voice cut through the noise. I'm saying we were both responsible. Victor's voice broke. I was skimming wages because the company wasn't paying fair prices for ore. I was trying to keep the mine profitable, keep men employed. Daniel found out and threatened to destroy everything rather than work with me to find a solution. We fought. I said things I regret. And then the tunnel collapsed, and everyone I loved was dead, and the only person left to blame was standing in front of me, telling me it was all my fault. Emma felt tears streaming down her face, not for Victor, but for the terrible complexity of what had happened, the way tragedy had twisted two brothers against each other until both believed they were right and both were destroying themselves to prove it. But that doesn't excuse what you did after. Emma forced the words out. You forged documents. You threatened me. You burned Jackson's barn. You hunted me across 4 territories with 5 children who'd done nothing wrong, because you were going to destroy the last thing I had left. Victor's eyes were wet, now his voice desperate. The mine is all I have, the only thing that gives Catherine's death meaning. If I can keep it running, keep men employed, keep the town alive, then maybe she didn't die for nothing. Harrison held up a hand for silence. This is the problem with justice. It's rarely as simple as innocent and guilty. He looked at both of them. You've both lost people you loved. You've both committed acts you justify as necessary. You've both suffered more than anyone should have to suffer. So what now? Emma's voice was barely a whisper. Where does that leave us? It leaves us with evidence that needs examination and testimony that needs verification. Harrison straightened his papers. But before I make any determinations, there's someone else who needs to speak. Martha Jenkins stood from her pew in the 3rd row. Your Honor, if I may. Mrs. Jenkins. Harrison's voice held respect. You have testimony to add. Martha walked to the front of the church, her cane tapping against the wooden floor, with the authority of someone who'd lived long enough to have earned the right to speak truth. I have documents that Daniel Cross gave me 6 months before his death. Ledgers showing Victor's theft safety reports showing the tunnel in question had been flagged as unstable 3 times before the collapse, and a letter Daniel wrote to the territorial governor detailing everything. She produced a leather folder from her bag, passing it to Harrison. But I also have something else. Letters from Victor Cross to his wife Catherine, written in the weeks before her death. She looked at Victor with something like pity. Letters where he admits he knew about the structural problems, but couldn't afford to shut down the mine because too many families depended on the income. Victor's face had gone ashen. How did you? Catherine and I were friends. Martha's voice was gentle. She showed me those letters because she was worried about you, worried about the stress you were under, worried about the impossible choices you were making. She wanted my advice about how to help you. Harrison read through everything, his face grave. So we have 2 men, both aware of danger, both choosing to prioritize different values. Daniel chose exposing corruption over economic stability. Victor chose keeping the mine open over perfect safety. And both choices contributed to the disaster that killed 32 people, 34. Victor's voice was hollow. Catherine and my son make 34. The church had gone silent, the congregation absorbing the weight of what they were hearing. This wasn't a simple story of good versus evil. This was tragedy built on tragedy, grief, breeding grief until no one could remember where the original sin began. Your Honor, Emma's voice was steady despite her tears. I don't deny that Daniel made mistakes, but Victor has spent 2 years trying to destroy me instead of facing his own guilt. He burned my barn, poisoned my well, threatened my children. Those aren't the actions of a man seeking justice. Those are the actions of a man who can't accept that he's human and humans fail. She turned to face Victor directly. I'm sorry Catherine died. I'm sorry your son died. I'm sorry you lost everything in one terrible day. But making me pay for your grief won't bring them back. It won't undo what happened. It won't make the pain stop. Victor stared at her, and Emma saw something crack in his expression. You don't understand, his voice was ragged. If I stop, if I admit I was wrong, then I have to face what I did. I have to accept that my choices killed her. And I can't live with that. Then don't live with it alone. Pastor Gray spoke up from the side of the church. Victor, you've been carrying this guilt for 2 years, letting it poison everything you touch. But you don't have to keep carrying it. There's forgiveness available if you're willing to ask for it. Forgiveness won't bring Catherine back. No, but it might let you live with yourself again. Gray's voice was firm. And it might keep you from destroying more innocent people in your quests to outrun your own conscience. Harrison rapped his gavel. Based on the evidence presented, I find that both parties bear some responsibility for the circumstances that led to this conflict. However, he looked directly at Victor. Sheriff Cross, your actions in pursuing Mrs. Reed have crossed legal and ethical boundaries. Arson, intimidation, abuse of authority. These are serious crimes that I cannot overlook, regardless of your personal tragedy. Victor's shoulders slumped. So what's your determination? You will surrender your badge and weapon to me immediately. You will face charges for the barn burning and any other crimes committed in your pursuit of Mrs. Reed. Harrison's voice was implacable. And you will receive a psychiatric evaluation to determine if you're fit to stand trial or if you need medical intervention for your grief. And Emma Victor's voice was barely audible. What happens to her, Mrs. Reed's evidence regarding the forged documents is compelling. Her actions in fleeing with the children, while unorthodox, were reasonable given the circumstances and your pursuit. Harrison looked at Emma. You're free to go, Mrs. Reed. No charges will be filed. The children remain in your custody. Emma's knees buckled. Jackson caught her holding her upright as relief crashed through her body like a wave. It's over. She couldn't quite believe it. It's really over. Not quite. Victor's voice was different now, empty of anger, hollow with resignation. I need to say something. Harrison gestured permission. Victor turned to face Emma, and she saw tears streaming down his face. I'm sorry. For everything. For the threats, the fire, the fear I put you and those children through. You were right. None of it brought Catherine back. None of it made the pain stop. It just spread the poison to more people. Emma wanted to hate him, wanted to refuse his apology, wanted him to suffer as she'd suffered. But looking at his broken face, she saw only another person destroyed by grief and hate felt too heavy to carry anymore. I accept your apology, her voice was thick. But you need to accept that you can't undo the past by destroying the future. You need to get help, Victor. Real help, I know. Victor turned to Harrison. I'll surrender my badge. I'll face whatever charges you bring. I'll do the evaluation. He looked at Emma one more time. Tell those children I'm sorry they were caught in the middle of something that had nothing to do with them. I will. Harrison stood gathering his papers. This hearing is concluded. Sheriff Cross, you'll come with me. Mrs. Reed, you're free to go. He paused. And to everyone here, let this be a lesson about the cost of letting grief turn to rage. Judge fairly, show mercy when you can. And remember that behind every conflict are human beings carrying more pain than anyone can see. The church began to empty, people filing out in subdued silence, the expected drama having transformed into something more uncomfortable of moral complexity that defied simple narratives. Emma remained in her pew. Jackson's arm around her, the children pressed close. Annie leaned forward. Is it really over, Ma? It's really over, sweetheart. Grace's small voice piped up. Can we stay here at Mr. Kane's ranch? Emma looked at Jackson, the question hanging between them. He met her eyes and she saw the answer there before he spoke. If that's what you want, if that's what everyone wants. Jackson's voice was rough. There's room, there's always been room. Emma turned to the children. What do you think? Should we stay? Ben nodded immediately. I like it here. I like helping with the horses. Grace's face lit up. And I made friends. Real friends who don't care that we're not from here. Marcus's voice was quiet but firm. It's the first place that's felt safe. Tommy just climbed into Jackson's lap, pressing his face into the man's chest. Stay, Annie was the last to speak, her young face serious. You love him, Ma. She said it as fact, not question. I do, Emma's voice was steady, but I need to know you're okay with that. All of you, because we're a family, and family makes these decisions together. Annie looked at Jackson for a long moment, assessing, calculating, weighing. Then slowly she nodded. He's good. He won't hurt us. And he makes you smile again. She paused. Yeah, I'm okay with it. Emma felt tears spill over, but these were different tears, not fear or grief, but relief and joy, and the overwhelming sense that maybe finally they'd found a place to belong. Outside, the afternoon sun broke through clouds, casting long shadows across the snow. Victor Cross rode out of town in the back of a wagon flanked by two of Judge Harrison's men, heading toward Helena to face whatever justice awaited him. He looked back once at the church, his face a mask of loss and resignation, and Emma felt something twist in her chest. That wasn't quite pity, but wasn't quite satisfaction either. Just sadness for everyone who'd been broken by the mine collapse. Everyone who'd lost someone they loved. Everyone who'd let grief turn them into smaller, meaner versions of themselves. Martha appeared at Emma's elbow. You did good in there. Spoke truth without losing compassion. That's harder than people think. I don't feel compassionate. I feel exhausted. Those things aren't mutually exclusive. Martha smiled. Come on, I've got roast and potatoes waiting at the boarding house. You all need a proper meal that isn't cooked over a campfire or eaten standing up. They walked back to Martha's place in a loose group, the children running ahead with the energy of those who'd been forced to sit still too long, Jackson and Emma following more slowly, hands intertwined. You think he'll be okay? Emma asked. Victor, I mean. Jackson was quiet for a moment. I think he'll survive. Whether he'll be okay depends on whether he's willing to face what he's done and try to be better. Some people can't do that. Grief breaks them so completely, they never find their way back. And the ones who do, what makes them different, they find something worth living for beyond their pain. Jackson squeezed her hand. They find people who remind them that life has more to offer than just suffering. Like you found me. Like we found each other. That night after dinner at Martha's, and after the children had been put to bed in the boarding house rooms, Martha insisted they use Emma, and Jackson stood on the porch watching stars emerge in the clear Montana sky. The cold bit deep, but Emma barely felt it wrapped in Jackson's coat, and the warmth of knowing she was finally truly safe. Marry me, Jackson's voice was quiet but firm. Emma turned to look at him, shock and joy warring in her chest. What marry me, Titan? I know it's fast. I know we've only known each other a week, but I spent 3 years alone convincing myself I'd never want this again. And then you showed up and proved me wrong about everything. He took both her hands. Marry me, Emma. Let's make this permanent. Let's give those children the stability they deserve. Let's build something that can't be taken away by badges or threats or the past. Emma's tears came hot and fast. Yes, God, yes, I'll marry you. They kissed under the stars, two people who'd walked through fire and found each other on the other side. Around them, Copper Creek settled into evening routine lamps, lit-in windows, smoke rising from chimneys, families gathering for dinner and conversation, and the small domestic rituals that made up a life. Inside the boarding house, Annie watched from the window, her young face serious. Grace appeared beside her, pressing close. Are they getting married? I think so. Grace's face split into a wide smile. So we really get to stay forever's a long time. Annie's voice was cautious, but something in her expression had softened. But yeah, I think we really get to stay. Below, Jackson and Emma broke apart, foreheads pressed together, breathing in sync. Tomorrow they'd start planning a wedding. Tomorrow they'd figure out how to merge two fractured families into one whole. Tomorrow they'd begin the work of building a future. But tonight they just stood together, holding on, grateful to have survived the storm and found harbor in each other's arms. In Helena, Victor Cross sat in a cell staring at nothing, his mind circling the same questions he'd been asking for 2 years. Was Daniel responsible? Was he? Did it matter anymore who struck the match when everyone had burned outside his cell? Judge Harrison spoke with the doctor about psychiatric evaluation, about trauma and grief and the way human minds broke under pressure. about whether healing was possible for someone who'd spent so long running from his own guilt. Victor didn't know if he wanted to be healed, didn't know if he deserved it, but somewhere in the darkness of that cell, he made a decision not to fight the charges, not to continue destroying himself and others in a futile quest for revenge that would never satisfy. He asked for paper and pen, wrote a letter to Emma that he'd never send, wrote an apology to Catherine's memory, wrote a confession to Daniel's ghost, and then for the first time in 2 years he wept. Not the bitter tears of rage, but the cleansing tears of someone who'd finally stopped running and turned to face the darkness he'd been fleeing. It didn't make the pain stop, but it made the pain bearable, made it something he could carry instead of something that carried him. In the morning, he'd begin the long road toward whatever redemption was possible for someone who'd done what he'd done. But tonight in that cell, he let himself grieve properly for the first time since the mine had taken everything he loved. And somewhere in whatever place the dead inhabited, Catherine forgave him. Not because he deserved it, but because forgiveness was never about deserving. It was about letting go of the weight that dragged you under, about choosing to swim toward shore instead of surrendering to the depths. The stars wheeled overhead, indifferent and beautiful. The world kept turning. And somewhere between revenge and forgiveness, justice and mercy, punishment, and redemption, broken people took their first stumbling steps toward healing. 2 weeks later, the new barn stood complete, its timber still pale and raw, but solid, a testament to what community could build when it chose to care. Emma stood in the doorway, breathing in the scent of fresh-cut wood and hay, remembering the night she'd first seen this place, collapsed in the old barn, fever burning through her 5 children, huddled close, and a stranger's voice cutting through her delirium like a lifeline. Now that stranger was about to become her husband. Martha Jenkins had taken over wedding preparations with the efficiency of a general planning a campaign. The ceremony would be simple afternoon service at the church, followed by dinner at the boarding house for anyone who wanted to attend. Emma's dress was another of Sarah's, the cream-colored one with lace at the collar that Martha had altered to fit perfectly. "You look like you're about to face a firing squad instead of a preacher." Martha's voice came from behind her, sharp but not unkind. Emma turned, managing a weak smile. "Just nervous. About marrying Jackson, or about everything that comes after both? Neither." Emma pressed a hand to her stomach. "I keep waiting for something to go wrong. For Victor to escape, for the judge to change his mind, for Jackson to realize he's making a mistake. That man spent 3 years mourning a ghost." Martha's voice was firm. "You brought him back to life. He knows exactly what he's getting, and he wants it with everything he's got." Through the barn door, Emma could see Jackson working with Ben and Marcus, teaching them how to properly stack hay bales. The boys' faces were animated, engaged, learning not just the work, but the rhythm of life on a ranch. Tommy chased chickens in the yard while Grace helped Annie hang laundry, their laughter carrying on the cold February wind. This was real. This was happening. Emma was about to marry a good man and give her children the stable home they'd been searching for across 4 territories. A rider approached from the east, and Emma's hand went instinctively to her side where a gun used to rest. But it was only Pastor Gray dismounting with a package in his hands. "Mrs. Reed, this came for you this morning. Express courier from Helena." Emma's blood went cold. Helena meant Judge Harrison. Helena meant Victor. She took the package with trembling hands, her name written across the front in handwriting she didn't recognize. Gray's voice was gentle. "Want me to open it?" "No." Emma squared her shoulders. "Whatever it is, I can handle it." Inside were 2 items, an official document from Judge Harrison in a sealed letter. Emma read the document first, her eyes scanning the legal language until she found what mattered. Victor Cross had been declared mentally unfit to stand trial due to severe psychological trauma and grief-induced psychosis. He'd been remanded to a psychiatric hospital in Helena for treatment. His badge permanently revoked, his right to practice law enforcement terminated. The criminal charges for arson and intimidation remained on record, but would be suspended pending successful completion of treatment. If he made sufficient progress, he'd be released under strict supervision. If he didn't, he'd remain institutionalized indefinitely. Emma should have felt triumph. Instead, she felt only tired relief that the threat was neutralized, tempered by sadness for everyone the mine collapse had destroyed. The second letter was from Victor himself, his handwriting shaky but legible. "Emma, I don't expect forgiveness. I don't deserve it. But I need you to understand something that I only realized after Judge Harrison ordered the psychiatric evaluation. When Catherine died, something in me broke so completely that I couldn't see straight anymore. Every time I looked at your face, I saw Daniel. Every time I thought about the mine, I saw Catherine's body being pulled from the rubble. My grief became rage and my rage became obsession, and before I knew it, I'd spent 2 years hunting you when what I was really hunting was a way to make the pain stop. The doctors here say I have what they call complicated grief, that I never processed Catherine's death properly, never allowed myself to mourn, because mourning meant accepting that she was gone and I couldn't protect her. So I turned my guilt outward, made you the villain of my story because facing my own culpability was too painful. I'm telling you this not to excuse what I did, but to explain it. You deserve better than to be hunted by a broken man who couldn't face his own demons. Your children deserve better than to be terrorized because I was too cowardly to grieve properly. I'm getting help now. Real help. I don't know if I'll ever be the man I was before the collapse, but I'm trying to be someone who can live with what happened without destroying everyone around me. There's a fund, Catherine's life insurance, and my savings. I've instructed my lawyer to establish it as a trust for your children's education. It's not enough. Nothing could be enough, but it's something. A start toward making amends for the damage I caused. Take care of those children, Emma. Give them the life they deserve. And if you can find it in yourself to forgive me someday, not today, maybe not for years, I'd be grateful. But if you can't, I understand that too. I'm sorry for everything. Victor Cross. Emma read the letter twice, tears streaming down her face. Not for Victor exactly, but for the waste of it all. 2 years of running that could have been avoided if he'd sought help after Catherine's death, if someone had recognized his breakdown, if grief counseling had been available in a place like Ridgeway. Jackson appeared at her side, reading her face before the words came out. What is it? She handed him the letter. He read in silence, his jaw tight, but when he looked up, his eyes held the same complicated sadness Emma felt. He's getting help and paying for the children's education. Emma's voice was thick. It doesn't undo what he did, but it's something. Jackson folded the letter carefully. More than most men in his position would offer. Do you think he can get better, really better? I don't know. Jackson pulled her close. But I know he's trying, and trying counts for something. More than giving up anyway. Emma pressed her face into his chest, breathing in the scent of hay and horses and home. I don't want to think about Victor today. Today I want to marry you and give our children a family and start building something good instead of running from something bad. Then that's what we'll do. Jackson kissed the top of her head. Everything else can wait. The ceremony was simple, beautiful in its simplicity. Emma walked down the aisle with Annie on one side and Grace on the other, Ben and Marcus and Tommy trailing behind like an honor guard. The church was packed. The entire town had turned out, people who'd been strangers 2 weeks ago, now invested in this love story born from crisis. Pastor Gray's words were brief but powerful, speaking about second chances and chosen families, and the way love could bloom in the most unlikely circumstances. Jackson's hands were steady as he slipped the ring onto Emma's finger. Sarah's ring, which he'd asked Emma's permission to use, which Emma had accepted because it felt right to honor the woman who had shaped Jackson into someone capable of opening his heart again. Emma's own vows caught in her throat, emotion overwhelming her, but she pushed through. I promise to stand beside you in joy and sorrow, to build a home worthy of the children we're raising, to honor your past while creating our future, to choose you every day for as long as we both live. Jackson's eyes were bright with unshed tears. I promise to protect you and these children with everything I have, to be worthy of the trust you've placed in me, to make Sarah proud of the man I'm becoming, and to love you with the kind of love that doesn't count cost or demand perfection, just shows up every day and tries its best. When Gray pronounced them married, the church erupted in applause. Emma kissed Jackson with the feeling of coming home after years of wandering, of finding harbor after endless storms. The children pressed close, and for the first time in 2 years, Emma felt completely, utterly safe. The dinner at Martha's was loud and chaotic and perfect. Children ran between tables, adults laughed and told stories, and somewhere between the main course and dessert, Annie appeared at Emma's elbow. Can I talk to you? Outside? Emma followed her onto the porch, worry flickering. What's wrong? Nothing's wrong. Annie's voice was softer than Emma had ever heard it. I just, I wanted to say something before I lose my nerve. Emma waited, giving the girl space to find her words. I've been calling you Ma for months now, since Kansas, maybe longer. But it always felt like a placeholder. Like I was borrowing someone else's mother because mine was gone. Annie's hands twisted together. But today, watching you marry Jackson, watching you choose this family, the same way we're choosing you, I realized it's not borrowing. You are my mother, not by blood, but by choice. And choice is stronger. Emma's throat closed up, tears spilling over. So I wanted to ask permission. Annie looked up, her young face vulnerable in a way Emma rarely saw. Can I call you Mom? Not Ma like it's temporary, but Mom like it's permanent, like you're mine and I'm yours, and that's never going to change. Emma pulled her into a fierce embrace. Yes, God, yes. You've been my daughter since the day I found you stealing bread at that depot. I've just been waiting for you to realize it. Annie's composure shattered. She buried her face in Emma's shoulder and sobbed, not sad crying, but the release of years of holding herself together, of being strong when she needed to be soft, of protecting her heart, when what she really wanted was to let someone in. I love you, Mom. The words sounded strange on Annie's tongue, unfamiliar, and new and perfect. I love you too, sweetheart. Emma held her tight. Forever and always. You're mine now. All of you are mine. They stood together in the cold Montana evening, mother and daughter by choice, and Emma felt something settle in her chest that had been restless for years. This was what home felt like. Not a place, but people who chose to stay even when leaving would be easier. Later that night, after the celebration ended and the children were settled at Martha's for one more night, giving Jackson and Emma privacy for their wedding night, Emma found Jackson standing by Sarah's grave beneath the old pine tree. The moon was full, casting silver light across the snow, making the carved headstone stand out stark and beautiful. Jackson knelt, his hand resting on the cold stone, his voice too low for Emma to hear from where she stood at the edge of the trees. She almost retreated, gave him privacy for this moment, but something made her stay, made her witness. I brought someone to meet you, Jackson's voice carried now clear into the cold night air. Her name's Emma. She's got 5 children. 5, Sarah, can you imagine? And she's brave and strong and nothing like you, but somehow perfect anyway. He paused and Emma saw his shoulders shake. I thought loving her meant forgetting you. Thought I had to choose between honoring your memory and building a future. But Emma helped me understand something. He laughed, the sound wet with tears. She helped me understand that you'd be furious with me for thinking that way. You'd tell me I was being a fool, that love doesn't run out just because you give it to someone new. Emma pressed a hand to her mouth, silent tears streaming down her face. So I'm here to tell you I'm letting go. Not of you, never of you, but of the grief that's been keeping me frozen for 3 years. Jackson's voice broke. I'm going to marry this woman. I did marry her, actually, this afternoon. And I'm going to raise these children, and I'm going to live the life you wanted me to live after you were gone. The one full of balm and mess and people who need me. He stood slowly, his hand trailing across the headstone one last time. Thank you for 20 years of happiness. Thank you for teaching me what love looks like. And thank you for letting me go. Jackson pressed his forehead to the cold stone. I'll come visit sometimes, tell you about the kids, bring flowers in spring. But I won't come to hide anymore. Won't come to avoid living. I'll come because I want to share good news with someone I loved, not because I'm too scared to move forward. Emma stepped into the clearing and Jackson turned, his face wet with tears, but somehow lighter, as if a weight he'd been carrying had finally been set down. She came to him, wrapping her arms around his waist, and they stood together beneath the pine tree, where one love had ended and another had found space to begin. Thank you, Jackson's voice was rough against her hair. For what? For reminding me that hearts don't run out of room, that loving you doesn't mean betraying her, that I'm allowed to be happy again. Emma pulled back just enough to see his face. You're allowed to be happy. We all are. After everything we've survived, we've earned it. They walked back to the cabin, hand in hand, stars wheeling overhead, their breath visible in the cold. Inside, a fire waited warmth and shelter, and the beginning of forever. Tomorrow they'd collect the children from Martha's and begin the work of being a family. But tonight was just theirs, 2 people who'd walked through darkness and found each other on the other side. 5 years later, the ranch had transformed into something Sarah would have loved and Emma had built with her own hands. The barn stood solid and weathered now, no longer new, but tested by Montana winters and proven strong. Fields that had lain fallow during Jackson's grief years now produced hay and oats. The herd had grown from 2 horses and a milk cow to something respectable. But the biggest changes were the children. Annie was 17 now, tall and confident, helping Martha Jenkins run the boarding house while taking correspondence courses from a teaching college in Boston. She'd decided she wanted to help other children like herself, orphans and runaways who needed someone to believe in them. Marcus worked at Thomas Reeves' blacksmith shop. His teenage anger transformed into the focused intensity of craftsmanship. He was saving money to buy his own forge someday, talking about staying in Copper Creek, building a life in the town that had given him sanctuary. Ben was 13, all gangly limbs and enthusiasm, spending every spare moment with the horses Jackson bred and trained. He had a gift for it, a natural understanding of how to gentle even the wildest Mustang. Grace was 12, split between childhood and the edge of something more complicated, but still quick to laugh and quicker to help anyone who needed it. She volunteered at the church, organizing food drives and reading to elderly shut-ins. And Tommy was 8 now, barely remembering the desperate flight across territories, the fear and hunger and cold. To him, Jackson had always been Papa, and this ranch had always been home, and the idea that things could have been different was abstract, unreal. Emma stood on the porch watching them work, her hand resting on her swollen belly. 6 months pregnant with Jackson's child, a daughter they decided to name Catherine Sarah, honoring both the woman Jackson had lost and the woman Victor had lost. Because Emma had learned that forgiveness didn't erase the past, but it made the future possible. A wagon appeared on the eastern ridge, moving slowly, and Emma felt her stomach tighten with old instinct. Jackson emerged from the barn, his hand instinctively moving to the rifle he kept by the door. 3 years of peace hadn't entirely erased the memory of danger. But as the wagon drew closer, Emma saw what Jackson saw. A woman driving, her face hollow with exhaustion. In the back, children huddled together, wrapped in blankets too thin for February cold. 3 of them, maybe 4, hard to tell from this distance. The wagon stopped in the yard and the woman climbed down slowly, every movement speaking of bone-deep weariness. She looked at Emma, at Jackson, at the solid house and barn, at the children who'd stopped working to watch. "Please." The woman's voice was raw, desperate. "We have nowhere else to go. Someone in town said that you'd helped others before. Said you understood what it was like to run." Emma exchanged a glance with Jackson, saw the question in his eyes. The memory of another February night 5 years ago, when she'd stood exactly where this woman stood now, begging for mercy from strangers. "What's your name?" Emma's voice was gentle. "Rebecca. Rebecca Wells." The woman's composure cracked. "My husband died 3 months ago. His brother wants custody of my children and says I'm unfit. He's got lawyers and money, and I've got nothing except these kids and the clothes on our backs." Annie appeared from inside the house, taking in the scene with sharp eyes that had learned to read desperation. She looked at Emma, a question in her gaze. Emma nodded once, decision made. Annie's face split into a smile and she moved toward the wagon. "Let's get you inside. You must be freezing." Annie's voice was warm, welcoming. "We've got stew on the stove and beds for everyone." Rebecca's eyes filled with tears. "You're helping us." "Just like that. You don't even know us. We know enough." Jackson's voice was firm. "We know you need help. That's all we need to know." As the children climbed down from the wagon, 2 boys and 2 girls ranging from maybe 6 to 12, Emma felt time fold in on itself. 5 years ago, she'd been the one seeking sanctuary. Now she stood on the other side, offering what had been offered to her, continuing the cycle of kindness that had saved her life. Rebecca followed Annie inside the children, trailing behind with wide eyes and cautious hope. Jackson put his arm around Emma's shoulders, pulling her close. "You sure about this?" Emma leaned into him, watching the last child disappear through the door. "When I was running terrified with 5 kids and nowhere to go, you gave us everything. How can I do less for someone standing where I stood? So we're in the rescue business now. We're in the family business." Emma's voice was firm. "And family doesn't turn away people in need." Jackson kissed the top of her head, his hand moving to rest on her pregnant belly where their daughter grew. "I love you, Emma Kane. I love you too." They stood together on the porch, the cold Montana wind cutting through the yard, carrying the scent of snow and pine and possibility. Inside the house that had held so much grief had become a place of laughter and healing, of children finding hope and adults learning to trust again. Somewhere the cycle would continue. Rebecca would find her feet, her children would find stability, and someday they'd be the ones offering shelter to the next desperate soul who arrived with nothing but need. This was the legacy Sarah had left, and Emma had carried forward not wealth or property, but the simple, radical act of opening doors when the world insisted they stay closed, of seeing humanity in strangers, of believing that broken people could heal if given the space and time and love to do it. The stars emerged as darkness fell, countless points of light scattered across velvet sky. Tomorrow would bring its own challenges, its own joys and sorrows and complications. But tonight there was warmth and safety, and the knowledge that home wasn't a place you found, it was something you built, one act of courage at a time, one open door, one offered hand, one whispered promise that you're not alone anymore. The barn door swung open in the wind, and Jackson moved to secure it. Emma followed, and together they walked across the yard they'd defended, past the grave they'd honored, toward the shelter they'd created from ashes and hope, and the stubborn belief that kindness was never wasted even when, especially when it cost everything you had to give. Because in the end, that's what love was. Not the easy affection of convenient circumstances, but the hard choice to show up for people who needed you to build something worth protecting, to transform fear into sanctuary and strangers into family. Emma Kane had learned that lesson in a barn 5 years ago. Now she'd spend the rest of her life teaching it to everyone who found their way to her door. The light in the window burned warm and steady, a beacon in the darkness, promising shelter to anyone brave enough to ask. And in the years to come, many would.